Folks, again, welcome. The voice you're listening to and the picture you're seeing there from the rolling hills of the Palouse in Eastern Washington is Ray Ledgerwood. It's my pleasure, my honor to be your moderator today for the National Watershed Coalition webinar on Public Law 566 and other watershed programs and the utilization and feedback sessions that we have today. The purpose of today's session is to provide training and to answer questions on 3 actual watershed programs utilization, the application processes, the information and data needed, and the public budget development and implementation. And a little bit probably about public outreach too. There's some examples in here that are going to be shared with you later. We're going to do that the first 90 minutes of today's 3-hour session, and then we're going to turn our attention to a listening session in a town hall. We'll probably be answering more questions that you had during the course of the event today. And then also we're going to be wanting to hear from you via the chat on what NRCS can do to make the watershed programs even better than they are. And so we've had some great improvements in those, and we want to have even more. So again, get out your piece of paper, a pencil or something to write with, jot down those ideas. And for those of you that just joined us, go ahead and type in National Watershed Coalition in the chat box. That way we'll know that our machines are working together. Our presenters today, a primary speaker will be Kevin Farmer, the branch chief of the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service Watershed Programs branch. And joining him today will be Jesse Wilson. And Jesse is our national program manager for watershed rehabilitation. A couple of outstanding folks. Ralph got the day off, and so we're not going to have Ralph today, but we look forward to listening and learning from Kevin and Jesse as our primary speakers. And not only that, but we have Dan Siebert, our National Watershed Coalition Executive Director, and Lisa Knopf-Hohen, our National Watershed Coalition Chair, and they're going to be speaking to you in just a bit. My name again is Ray Ledgerwood, your moderator for today's session. Dan and Lisa, we didn't rehearse this, so who wants to go first with some welcoming comments, please?
Ladies first.
Why, thank you, Dr. Dan. Welcome to the webinar. It's kind of fun to sit and watch the ticker as the numbers go up. It's great to see so many people on the call and conference today, 115 right now. And that's obviously we've got a topic that is of great interest to a lot of sponsors and folks, and hope they can get the answers that they're looking for. I know Kevin is going to be able to provide a lot of those answers for you today. This is one in a series of webinars that we've done over the past year, and all of them have been well attended, and I think the subject matter has been of great interest to many folks. If you like the offerings that we've had over the past year, those are made available through your support of the National Watershed Coalition. So this is my plug to you all to become members of the organization so that we can continue to provide useful training and education to the membership. So with that, Dan, I will let you carry on.
Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate everybody sharing part of their work day with us today. We are doing a webinar today that is a twin to a webinar that we put on yesterday. And it was really a rewarding session yesterday, and I'm sure it will be today as well. You're going to have an opportunity to interact with NRCS watershed leaders. If you have burning questions for them, in addition to the questions that we've already solicited, we welcome those. Kevin has generously offered to respond to all the questions, either verbally or in written form following the webinar. So that's much appreciated. I think Lisa pretty well covered it. If you enjoy this webinar, if you go back and look at some of the previous webinars we've held and recorded, if you like what you see and you're not a Watershed Coalition member, we would love to have you, because the collective intellectual power of our membership is our strength. So we welcome you if you choose to join us. Ray, I think that's about it. I think we're ready to move ahead.
Very good. Lisa and Dan, really appreciate that. How painless is that to become a member of the National Watershed Coalition? What are the steps involved?
Well, it just depends on how precious about $25 is to you as an individual, and maybe how precious $75 might be to your organization, or perhaps if you look in the mirror and see yourself as a watershed leader and would like to be a board member, it's about $150. So
Wow.
dues are easy. There are forms and additional membership information on our website.
Well, let's keep going, Dan, and share with the folks what the organization is and what it does.
For sure. We are a 501c3. We're made up of national, regional, and state local organizations. We are basically an organization of organizations. We have individual members. We have members that I would classify as units of government. But the common thread is that we all advocate for dealing with natural resource problems and issues, utilizing the watershed as a planning and implementation unit.
Excellent. And here's our current officers.
Yes, you heard from Lisa. Rex Isom from Texas is our immediate past chair. Our vice chair position is vacant but soon to be filled. And you see me in front of you. Barb Oltgen from Kansas is our longtime secretary treasurer. We are governed by a steering committee board of directors that's composed of individuals and representatives from the member organizations and associations. We have a variety of activities. Some of you may be more familiar with these than others, but we do conduct workshops and training sessions on a variety of watershed program topics. We serve as a resource to connect sponsors who have completed projects. We also provide assistance in developing sources for project funding. We hold a biennial National Watershed Conference, and we have one of those coming up in October in Spokane. And we develop a series of publications, all of which are available to you on our website, watershedcoalition.org. All are downloadable and usable. Same for specific publications. We also maintain a website and do our best to drive young people off of Facebook by the thousands, utilizing our Facebook page for things besides really flaky social media posts. So we welcome you to come find us on Facebook. We do put information on there about our activities and our calendar. So dive in, we're easy to find there. There's our website address. Some of the things that you'll find on the website. And I would point out that following this webinar, within about 2 weeks or so, you will be able to access the webinar again from our website. We do have a YouTube channel, and there'll be probably a link on our website that'll take you over where if you want to watch it or go back and revisit some of Kevin's PowerPoint, it'll all be available. It'll take us a week to 10 days to get that up, but we hope that you'll utilize that, and hopefully you'll find it helpful.
Thanks, Dan. And just proof positive that we do more together than we can do ever separately. And just a sampling of what the National Watershed Coalition can do with you, and with you as a member, even better, and with you as an officer or on the board, even better than that. So we welcome you to those activities. Well, let's talk about a few logistics. All our lines are going to be muted today except for our presenters, and you see our presenters there on video today. The questions that we received a bunch of questions through registration. So don't dismay. We've got those. We're going to be going through those during the latter part of the first half and then the first part of the second half of our webinar today, broken up with a small break in between so that you can take care of your mental, physical, and health and well-being. And then via the web, you can use the chat feature on your computer. If you got something that you want to ask Kevin or one of the presenters, during the course of the event, we can also take a few of those questions that way too. We're going to get to as many questions as we can. Dan kind of spilled the beans. I was going to have Kevin speak to this question about questions and written questions. What about it, Kevin? What's your plan after the session here?
Yes, that is correct, Ray and Dan, and hello to everyone out there. I see we have over 123 participants, and we are excited to hear as many of your questions as possible, but we're more excited to provide answers to those questions. So what we decided to do is, because we won't be able to answer every question during this 3-hour platform, we're going to provide a written answer to all of the questions, including the ones we answered during the presentation, as well as some of the ones we answered throughout the Q&A session. So we'll just provide a written response to all the questions. Now, that obviously wouldn't include those questions like, some folks that don't have anything, or, I just wanted to know something in general about the program. So we don't necessarily have to respond to that. I'm hopeful that today's presentation will be an adequate response to that question for those who wanted just a brief overview or a better understanding. So every other question that is specific, though, we will provide a specific written answer to that.
And I think you'll find is what Kevin is saying too. Not only will they provide the written responses to those questions, that you've presented, but you also gave us a great deal of material that could be used during the presentation today. So many of the questions, the reason why you're going to want to stay live and work with us, throughout the webinar today is you're going to hear your question answered during the presentation, because Kevin and his staff put a lot of work into their presentation to answer some of those preloaded questions. Anyway, the presentation will be recorded. A couple of you asked that, and will be placed on the National Watershed Coalition website probably in a couple of weeks. Feedback is welcome. Always kudos, comments, questions to rayledgerwood@msn.com. And you'll be receiving a note from me after the webinar with that address, email address. Our agenda, pretty straightforward today. Welcome, self-introductions, the objective agenda, and logistics. Right to the Watershed Program utilization training that we're going to be doing, and filled with program questions and answers. And then the break right in between the program questions and answers and our listening session and program recommendations. Got that piece of paper again. I keep telling you, find that one recommendation that you want to recommend and be ready to load that up in the machine here in the second part of our webinar today. We're going to talk a little bit about program timelines and some events of the National Watershed Coalition. Dan will be able to repeat some of those toward the conclusion of our webinar today. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Kevin Farmer, Branch Chief, Watershed Programs Branch. Go ahead, Kevin. Let me switch over to you, and we'll see if we can get the machine over to you, Kevin, so you can control the slides today. Oh, hang on one second, making sure that I get that control over to you, right?
Look like it's coming.
We did that so well yesterday, didn't we? Huh?
Okay.
Let's find that again, shall we?
Looks like it's almost.
Hang on one second here. Sorry for the
Okay.
delay. We'll get over to you.
That just means my presentation has to be that much better because they're anticipating it.
It's going to be outstanding, I know for sure. And I just want to be able to get that to you. Doggone it. There we are.
If there's, okay. I was going to say, if there's an issue, I'll be happy to. Oh, there it is. There it is. Perfect.
Yeah. Yep. No, the issue was the short bald guy. Just getting it over to you, Kevin. So welcome to Kevin.
All righty. Thank you very much, Ray. Thank you very much, Dan and Lisa. I'm happy to have this opportunity for those of you out there, for us to participate with the National Watershed Coalition in this listening session and get some great feedback from you all as to what it is that we can do at NRCS to help improve program delivery and streamline and even improve just the overall execution of our watershed programs. Obviously, we hope that through this presentation, we will improve some knowledge and understanding of some of the programs for those of you who may not be as familiar with them. So that's some of the goal. So I hope that in this next 45, 50 minutes or so of presentation here, that we will give you a good overview of the program. But after that, we want to spend the balance of the time having a very good discussion and even answering questions about things that are on your mind and what we can do to make it better. So the way the program is going to be, where this presentation is set up, there are 3 specific programs within the Watershed Programs branch. We have the Watershed Operations Program, we call the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program. We have the Watershed Rehabilitation Program, and we also have the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. All 3 of those programs fall within the Watershed Programs branch. The Watershed Operations and the Rehab Program are under the authorities of Public Law 566, as well as for Watershed Operations, it's 534. And then for the EWP program, it's a somewhat separate program, but it does complement the work that's done under these Watershed Operations programs, and it allows for some emergency disaster recovery. So we're going to go through each of these 3 programs in depth, and we're going to do it in sections, starting with the Watershed Ops, then the Rehab, then the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. So just an overview of those 3 programs. Watershed Operations, it's a program that works with local, state, and tribal government organizations to protect our watersheds by installing vital infrastructure, which benefits communities in every state and every territory of this nation. It is a very broad and flexible program that is available to benefit our communities across this landscape. We're going to talk more about who those partners are later on in the presentation to give some specific concrete examples and details of what it means to be a partner. The Watershed Rehabilitation Program is an extension of that Watershed Operation Program. It provides both technical and financial assistance to rehabilitate and to extend the service life of those dams that were originally constructed with assistance of NRCS watershed programs under the Watershed Operations Program. We're going to talk about that and the eligibility there. Each of these 3 programs require that sponsor that I talked about earlier. Each of these 3 programs provide that technical and financial assistance. We're going to talk about that in more detail as we go throughout the presentation. EWP provides emergency repair and restoration recovery. So it's that emergency program. It's that program we use to go out in the middle, after a major hurricane or flood event, or after a tornado, or after even a volcano. We had some work in Hawaii 2 years ago after the volcanoes that hit and erupted there. So we have opportunities to go out and to help communities recover quickly in the site of a disaster, to help them to have recovery assistance through the EWP program. We're going to talk about that program. Some of you are very familiar with it and some may not be, but I hope by the end of this day, you'll have some level of familiarity with each of these 3 programs. So now let's look at some funding. We started with the timeline of the point in time of 2017, because that is actually the year when the Watershed Operations Program actually started to receive funding again. Prior to that, there was about a 9-year gap there where there was no funding. A couple of years, there was a little bit of funding here and there for special purposes. There was almost a 9-year period where there was no fixed appropriation for that program. So what we're looking at here is, if you look across the board at each of the 3 programs over the course of the last 5 years, what you'll notice is there is a trend for watershed operations where it started to actually go up some each year. And of those 5 years, we've had about $950 million appropriated by Congress for that program, which on average is a little over $200 million per year. And then for the Watershed Rehabilitation Program, we've had about $63 million appropriated, about roughly $15 million a year for that program. And then for the EWP program, you can see that it's not a uniform way in which program dollars are appropriated for that program. And the reason is because it receives funding through disaster supplemental appropriations. So in order for that program to receive funding, there has to be some level of a natural disaster to occur. And at that point, you'll start seeing funds appropriated into that program. You'll notice in 2020 and 2021 thus far, there haven't been any program dollars appropriated to that particular program. What we've been operating off to address the needs and the requests that sponsors have been submitting, actually those funds that have been received in prior years. One example of that is the funding in 2018, $541 million. That was a result of the hurricanes that season where we had Harvey, Irma, Maria, that all occurred in actually 2017, but the funding was received in fiscal year 2018. And then you all may remember in the Midwest, those the Iowa derecho and the Midwest floods and those storms that occurred in 2018. Well, some of that funding was provided in 2019, and you'll see that there on the screen. That's where a lot of that funding comes from. But even though the funding is cyclical and you don't necessarily know when it's going to come, obviously, or you can't necessarily plan it's going to come a given year, you can see that there was still about $861 million. I guess the big picture that you want to look at there is almost $2 billion in funding have been provided across the board for these three programs in the last 5 years. And we are managing projects and workloads associated with that $2 billion, roughly almost $2 billion to carry out the work that's going on. I will also note those asterisks. You see 3 asterisks starting in 2019, 2020, and 2021, those red asterisks for the Watershed Operations Program. Well, what happened is in 2019, as a result of the 2018 Farm Bill, we received funding of about $50 million. And we've been receiving that every year since for the Watershed Operations Program. Now, every other dollar you see on the screen, with the exception of those $50 million, are what we call annual funds. I'm sorry, no-year funds. Those no-year funds are funds that can be used until expended. That's why we're able to carry over some of that money through EWP. They're available until expended. However, those $50 million funds that are provided in the Farm Bill are not annual dollars, are actually annual dollars. They're not no-year money. So we have tried our best to dedicate those funds to those projects that are actually in construction and ready to move forward, because they have a tighter time window and what can actually be done there. And there's some restrictions on how those funds can be used. So we've provided those funds to some of those projects that are actually ready to actually take a big pot of money and actually move it into construction and things of that nature, so that we can actually accomplish the work that needs to be done fully. All right, so the watershed funding for fiscal year 2021, and this is a look back of the last complete fiscal year. So last year we funded 17 states for watershed ops and 16 states for watershed rehab, and then 33 states for EWP using that carryover funding. So as I mentioned earlier, you can see somewhat of a correlation there with rehab and ops. You kind of see some of the same kind of states doing things, and with EWP, you never know who's going to be involved because it depends on the disaster. But if you look at the numbers there, also, we broke it down by phase. So if you look at the numbers for ops and rehab, you have the assessments and investigations. So those watershed rehab assessments, or those watershed operation, preliminary investigation, feasibility investigations, those reports, you had about 16 reports in watershed ops and about 38 assessment reports in rehab that we were able to fund. And then with planning, the numbers in planning were about 38 watershed ops plans, and then 28 watershed rehab supplemental plans. And then obviously the numbers drop dramatically when you start getting into implementation, those design and construction phases. So only 5 designs were funded for watershed ops, and then 15 for rehab, and then construction 1 design, and then 1 construction, for watershed ops, and then 16 construction projects for watershed rehab. Now, this is what you can glean from this slide. Over time, you're gonna start to see those numbers at the bottom go up. And the reason for that is because as plans are completed, more and more going into design and into construction. So it does take some time to get out of planning, but every year we're expecting to see an uptick in the number of designs and then the number of construction projects, because every year we're going to be adding to those with projects that are now authorized and out of planning and ready to be actually implemented. Remedial, that number actually we want to see go down. We'd love to see that number go to 0. And the reason is because those remedial projects are those projects where there are deficiencies or defects and things that may have occurred that after those projects were installed under watershed operations, something happened to cause a premature deficiency or a failure of the project or the structure. And then as a result of that, we would want to go in and work with our sponsors to actually provide remedial assistance to repair those damages and those things that failed. We don't want to see damages. We don't want to see failures. So we're hoping that as we address them, that number will start to go down. And then with watershed funding for 2021, we're going to break it out by dollar now. So let's look at it by dollar. So we noticed the trends are almost reversed now. When you start looking at the number of, or the dollar amounts that went to those different phases, the dollars are higher at the bottom than they were at the top. So I'm going to explain what that means in a minute, but some of you probably already figured that out and already knew that. But for those assessments and investigations, we only averaged about $1 million or so for all of those assessments and all those investigations and reports that were done. For the plans, it was about 37 million for watershed ops for planning, and then about 6 million for rehab for those supplemental plans. But when you get to design, we only had a few designs there, but those watershed operation designs cost about $52 million to complete those few designs. And then for rehabilitation, it was about $2 million for those designs. And then for construction, we only had that one construction project, remember, in watershed ops? Well, that project was over $25 million. Our share was 25 million. So then the rehab projects that we had, they total up to about 11 million. And then that remedial project was about 890,000. So what I'm trying to show here is that over time, as those numbers at the bottom go up for the count and the numbers of projects in those phases, well, obviously what's going to happen is the demand for funding is going to go up as well. So you're going to notice that as we're trying to do multiple construction projects pretty soon here, it's going to be a little bit more challenging because they cost a lot more. And that $200 million, well, if you just do the math, you're not going to be able to do much more than 8 or so if you just gave it all to construction. So, you know, we do want to make sure that we have things in the pipeline in every area. And as we go through this presentation, we'll talk about some of that. So let's jump into it. I had mentioned before, the presentation is set up to go through each phase of each program, each of the 3 programs. So we're going to do that now, starting with watershed ops. And I'm going to go through each program in detail, and then we'll come around and do a little bit of a summary at the end. So for watershed operations, eligibility. In order for you to be eligible for this program to participate in it, you must be a public sponsor. That is one of those public organizations who fall either under a state or county or community or city or a town or a tribal organization, conservation district, some state agency. Those are those public sponsors. We're going to identify them again in another slide that I have later, but just wanted you to know those are those public sponsors. And it's the same for all 3 programs. For watershed ops, those projects must be less than 250,000 acres for a single project. However, 2 caveats there. One is, first of all, if the project is subdivided, there's an opportunity for the planning to be done in such a way that you can subdivide those projects and have those standalone pieces that are 250,000 acres or less. And then that's fine. You can do that. But also, starting in 2018, we've started to see language in the appropriation that allow for basically a waiver of that 250,000 acre limit that allow for those particular dollars to be used for projects for if the primary purpose was not for flood protection, that those dollars could be used and the 250,000 acre limit was basically waived or lifted. We didn't have to necessarily be held to that threshold of 250,000 acres. So that is a good thing. So that actually helps those non-flood protection type projects. In addition to that, another eligibility requirement is a maximum total capacity of any one structure of 25,000 acre feet of capacity. So that wasn't waived, so that's still in play. And then 20% of the benefits must be agricultural or rural related. All right, and that is required still. And then there is the requirement for an authorized NRCS watershed plan, EAEIS. Now, all of these things are statutory requirement. There's some law providing these, so that's why we limited the list to, hey, these are the things that at a bare minimum you must have to be eligible. So if you have these things as required by law, you're eligible to at least start to participate. That's the first bar. That's the first thing you want to meet. I will state that last one, the authorized plan. I know there's been a lot of questions about, hey, the 2018 Farm Bill had language in it that said, hey, the secretary could waive a plan if it was considered to be duplicative or unnecessary. Well, that is true. The Farm Bill did provide that language. However, one of the things that you have to kind of look at in context with that is that there are some federal requirements that each federal agency has to meet in order to participate in a watershed scale planning effort. And if those federal requirements aren't met, there was no waiver in the Farm Bill for those requirements to be met. So there's still a requirement that NRCS participate in a certain level of planning activities. So what that means is NRCS may cooperate with, let's say, another federal agency in the development of a plan. And as a cooperating agency, we may be able to adopt or adapt those plans that they had because we were a cooperating agency. And there's a process for that, but it's a lot quicker than developing just, say, a brand new plan. Most times it is. And then if there is a local entity though, so a non-federal agency or non-federal organization that has developed some type of a feasibility or watershed type of study, unfortunately, we can't just say we can adopt that because they're not a federal agency. So you can't just wholesale adopt that. But what you can do is build on it and help use that information to build out your plan and make it obviously a little bit easier for you to develop your plan. You can build on the information. But there's still those federal requirements that have to be met. There are still those public engagements that NRCS has to do. There are still those timelines where NRCS have to follow certain levels of public announcements and involvement. And there are certain steps that we have to actually make decisions on and accept and make sure that we've done certain analysis. Those things have to still be done. So those things were never waived. So just wanting to make sure everyone's clear on that. But, we're just looking at ways to make things quicker. So, hey, we're building off whatever is out there, whatever information is out there, what sponsors have done, what partners have done. And hopefully by building on what's out there, we can make things actually go quicker and find efficiencies when it comes to that planning part. So let's look at a few more things related to the overview of the Watershed Operations Program. NRCS, we assist local sponsors to implement watershed projects. This is a locally led process. This is a locally led program. So we work with local sponsors to assist in the implementation of a watershed project. We're not taking over. We're coming in to assist and work with you and provide technical and financial assistance to you. Projects are led by local sponsors with federal input, as I mentioned before. We provide technical and that financial assistance. Project sizes, once again, repeating this, they cannot exceed that 250 acres per sub watershed. So this time I did put that term in there, sub watershed, to kind of draw out that caveat that you can have those sub watersheds. But I didn't spell out the fact that, we have those waivers in the language because that's only provided by those appropriations. You have those waivers for those annual appropriations that we get. The 20% ag benefit, it's still statutorily required, so it's still there. And NRCS has to have an authorized plan and then congressional approval. This is important. In the event the federal contribution to the construction phase is in excess of $25 million, then there is a requirement that there be approval from Congress of the plan. So that is required, and you would want to know that so that you know that that process is going to have to take place. And it does take a little time to make sure we get approval from both the Senate and the House as required. That threshold was actually raised from 5 million to 25 million. It was 5 million, and we've since gotten it raised, and that was about 2018 as well when that was raised.
So we got our first opportunity here to let your voice go recollect. You've been 3 hours on another one. Now you're 3 hours on this one. Drink that water. And then I got nice kudos here from you from one of our folks. One of our folks said, thank you for mentioning the 2018 Farm Bill's allowance for a discretionary waiver of the required Public Law 566 Watershed Plan in some circumstances where the other planning documents have already been completed. Is there any guidance put out by the NRCS to help applicants and staff understand when a discretionary waiver would be appropriate? So seems like a timely question that we better tackle right now. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So as I had mentioned, that waiver, and I want to make sure I'm being pretty clear in this, that waiver language that you saw is only effective when you start thinking about, was NRCS already a cooperating agency, which is not anything necessarily new. So we haven't necessarily put guidance out about that part of it, because what we're encouraging is folks, you still want to work with NRCS to make sure that these plans are developed appropriately, because the waiver doesn't necessarily mean that we can go out and waive a plan. What that waiver means is that if everything that NRCS is required by law to do has been done. So at that point, you're basically saying that we're already in the process of working together to make sure that we've covered all our federal requirements and that CEQ requirements have been completed, and that we've met all the NEPA requirements, and that we're doing what we have to do as a federal agency. So we have not actually put out any new guidance on that waiver per se. because the waiver itself doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be able to waive everything that people were actually first thinking that we could waive. So on a case-by-case basis, we're reviewing these. And if we've been working with another federal agency cooperating and there's an opportunity there, NRCS will take that opportunity if it's out there. And that's actually been the case already. If there's an opportunity where we've cooperated or been a coordinating agency on another federal agency's effort to develop a plan, well, we're going to definitely capitalize on that and take advantage of it in such a way that we can then do a process of adopting that plan and not have to start from scratch.
Very good. Well, and not related, but just to give you a bit of a break here, are the plans at the national level to bring back the old watershed planning design staff? And I don't meant old in age, but I think they meant the old in used to be.
I'm going to answer it in both ways, ironically,
Yeah.
because, and I'm going to start with the latter. And here's why. In 2020, so this is not the answer to your question, but I'm going to add this information. I'm going to come back to your question. But in 2020, we were successful in being able to get the language changed for when the ACES program could be utilized. Now, the watershed operations, rehab, and EWP programs are eligible to use funding to actually participate in ACES. So yes, we are able to actually bring back some older workers. The actual organization that we work with is called the National Older Workers Organization. So that's actually the name of it. So we're able to do that. I know that's not your question, but that's important because if there is talent and skills out there that we can capitalize on to actually bring back and build back some of that capacity, we now have the authority to utilize watershed funds to do that. And that's important. And it dovetails into your next question. So your real question was about, are we going to set up the structure for more of those watershed type teams? So we have been in I guess we've considered and looked at ways where we can build out staff and build out our technical capacity as an agency to address the watershed program needs as this program continues to grow and expand over time. So here recently, obviously, you can see that we've grown quickly. So in order to do that, some proposals have gone out for us to look at staffing on a regional scale, look at staffing at a state-by-state level, and different ways that we can actually look at staffing increases. States are encouraged to already, with the direct hiring authority, to bring in staff that way just to start building that capacity there. Now, obviously, at that level, you're talking about entry level more so. What you're able to do is target some of those folks and train them up so that in years to come, they will be ready to take on some of those responsibilities more directly. And then we've had those, what we call, we had dam engineers. They were the engineers who we brought on, who were kind of like the watershed specific engineers. In an effort to do that, we spread them out throughout the country with a focused intention of watershed operation and maintenance focuses. And so we were able to do that. But specifically, as far as organizing those regional teams and those regional or even those state level watershed teams, we haven't made a fixed firm decision that that's where we're going to go. We're very close to making a decision at a national level, or I should say we're very close to exploring all the options at a national level, and soon hope to make a decision as to where we're going to go next so that we can meet that need. But in the meantime, we're doing everything we can to work with our partners and A&E firms to hire and bring on outside talent as we can, bringing back folks through ACES as we can. And then as we are able to hire and backfill some of those positions, we're keeping the watershed focus in mind. There have been few states that have actually hired individuals for the direct purposes of having them work on watershed programs. There are some states on this call, I know for a fact, that have those watershed directed and watershed type people who are already on their staff. So those are some of the things that NRCS has already started to do. We've also partnered and reached out to some of the states and, kind of shared staff some, not formally, but just shared staff where we could to share some of those responsibilities. So to wrap up and answer your question fully, I think the framework is kind of coming together for us to have that structure in place that we used to have, but it may not be to the same scale as it used to be many years ago. But I think we're going to definitely have something in place to meet the need and the challenge.
Thanks, Kevin. We appreciate you taking a little bit of time from your formal remarks here and answering those questions as they come up that are related to what you just talked about. We got another one I'll hold until we get to the EWP program. So
Okay, that's
fire
fine.
away. Thanks a lot.
All right,
Hope that
let's
water
do it.
bottle is
All
full.
right.
Yep.
All right. I think we've covered this one. So let's go to the outline. So this outline, in order for you to participate in the program, here's what you would want to kind of expect. So for Watershed Ops, it starts with a request from the sponsor. Sponsors will request NRCS assistance. After that, that's either a request for an authorization of a plan or to carry out an existing authorized plan. We call that a backlog. We call the new plan new projects, or prepare a watershed plan EIS. And then the sponsor would assist, NRCS would assist the sponsor with any feasibility reports and preliminary investigations. So I mentioned that before. We have a snappy new term we're using. We call it preliminary investigation feasibility report. PIFR is the acronym. We love acronyms, but basically that's something that has always been in place, a requirement for us to have a preliminary investigation report. But what we've done is we kind of put together a template and some more guidance that actually should be coming out next week to help our states in developing that PIFR. The goal there is to have that document that informs our state conservationists as they make decisions as to whether or not this is a project that we want to move farther into the program and actually commit federal funds to plan and authorize it for implementation. You know, sometimes there may be an idea or a thought to say, hey, do we want to go in and do some work here in this watershed? Here's an issue. Let's see if this is the appropriate program. Well, before we make that commitment and get into planning and spend millions of dollars on planning, it may be best to do a feasibility investigation and just do a report there to make a more informed assessment of what needs to be done first before we actually get into the planning and spend time there, and then have a plan that won't be authorized or can't be implemented. Then next is once we've gotten past the PIFR, that investigation report, project sponsors carry out and fund their specific parts of the watershed plan. Now we fund the planning part 100%, but once we get beyond the planning, we can fund the design at some points at 100%. We're going to talk about that, those different cost shares. But you know, when it comes down to actually implementing that authorized plan, then the sponsors work together with us to actually do the implementation to get those plans implemented. And then NRCS provides that financial and technical assistance. There you go again. That financial assistance to help make sure that we can get things implemented definitely through construction, that technical assistance to make sure that the planning and design and the funding for that is there, as well as the NRCS staff and the technical resources to carry us throughout all three phases of planning, design, and construction. So you have both those technical assistance through staff and technical assistance through actual dollars that we're providing as an agency.
And a quick question on that is the PIFR, or the preliminary
investigation feasibility report. Don't you like it?
Investigation feasibility. No wonder you say an acronym. Anyway,
yes.
That report, is it lead or paid for by NRCS?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, that is an NRCS type report. So it is definitely paid for by us, and we're providing the funds directly to our state offices to do that. And the goal, like I said, the goal there is to inform our state conservation. So that's more of an internally focused report to help our state conservation make a decision on whether or not we should move forward and invest federal funds to address the issue. So that's most of the purpose there. It's an NRCS type of document, but it is developed with our sponsors. It's not an internal document that we're doing in a silo. No, we want to work with our local sponsors to develop that document, but it needs to inform our state conservations to make that decision. We pay for that.
Thanks, Kevin.
All right, purposes. So here are some purposes of the Watershed Operations Program. Flood prevention and damage reduction, that's a known purpose that most people think about most of the time, but here's something you may not think about. Ag water management and irrigation, developing of a conservation and rural water supply, erosion and sediment control, fish and wildlife habitat enhancement, wetland creation and restoration, and then even those recreational opportunities, increased recreational opportunities. I didn't mention watershed rehabilitation because we're going to get into that. That's actually an authorized purpose. We're going to get into that later and look at it as a different program as a whole. So now let's talk about that cost share I was telling you about. So if you start looking at the cost shares that are available through financial assistance through NRCS. So if you look at it for flood prevention, if that's that purpose, then for flood prevention, we can pay up to 100% of the engineering and then up to 100% of the construction. So basically, if you have a project with the primary purpose of flood prevention, then that project is basically 100% paid for by NRCS. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have other costs, and we're going to talk about some of those other costs later. But as far as to getting the project from planning to construction up front, most of those costs that you see are paid for at 100% by NRCS, with the exception of some of those costs we're going to talk about when we get to budgeting. Then watershed protection. Engineering is 100%. Now, the reason the word very shows up there for construction is that because under watershed protection, and actually the watershed program as a whole, we can't utilize watershed operations funding to provide a higher cost share rate than another USDA program would provide for the same services. So, in the event that there is a watershed protection measure, whether it's a land treatment measure or some measure that's being done in this program that can also be done, let's say, EQIP. Well, we couldn't offer the same type of assistance that EQIP is offering and then pay more than the 75% that EQIP would pay. Now, obviously, there's those higher cost share rates that EQIP offers for limited resource areas and, socially disadvantaged, historically underserved communities. So we could match those rates, but we couldn't exceed what another program is doing. So we can't just say 100% there. It varies based on the work that's being done and the commensurate type of work that will be done through another program that USDA offers. Fish and wildlife and public recreation, up to 50% for the construction. But as you'll see, the engineering, we're doing mostly 100% of all the engineering. There's only one caveat, and we'll get to that here in a second. Ag water management, 75%. So now that one caveat for engineering is the municipal industrial water supply. That's not an area where we as an agency specialize in the development of municipal industrial water supply. So the engineering for that particular purpose has to be done by an outside source, and it has to be paid for by that outside, by the sponsor, not by NRCS, because that's not an area of expertise nor a responsibility for us when it comes to this type of program. So we will pay up to 50% for the purpose of M&I water supply, but as far as developing the technology and the engineering services needed to actually accomplish the plan, the design for that, I should say design for that, we would not pay for any of that. And then you see rehab up to 100% for both engineering and construction. Well, there's some truth in that, and most of you are probably thinking, hey, I thought it was 65 for 35, and that's true as well. We're going to get to that and explain that, but I'll just tell you right now, we can pay up to 100% of the construction cost. However, we can only pay 65% of the total project cost. I didn't show that here. We're going to talk about that when we actually get to the watershed rehabilitation program. We'll explain those differences. All right, so here's some statistics as far as the status of this one program. The Watershed Operations Program, in planning, we have 109 projects since 2017 that have been funded for planning. We've actually authorized 8 projects, and they're coming in every day. I know we have about 11 now that are about to come in, and we have more and more that are coming in. So they're coming in slowly but surely. They're coming in, but as they come in, we're going to be authorizing those and getting them to the next phase, which is design. We've funded 59 design projects, and 24 of them have been completed. We've funded 39 construction projects, and 6 of those have been completed. And we're expecting those numbers to go up every year. They're going up and they're going up. Obviously, the completions are going to go up, but even the funded is going to go up. How to apply. And by the way, on this slide, we're going to come back and touch on these in more detail here in a minute and show you some more facts and figures about time and things of that nature. But as far as how to apply, this is important. So as a sponsor, you can submit what's called a standard form 424. It's a request for federal assistance to our state office in order to apply for this particular program. You can also submit a letter of request and just write in your letter, your same information that you put in the SF 424. You can put it in a letter and just basically say, hey, who you are and all your contact information and all the folks' roles and responsibility, who's responsible for this, which particular program you're applying for, a description of the project that you have, what's the estimated funding that you anticipate for this type of a request that you're making, and then document your ability to actually meet your program eligibility requirements, which I stated earlier. Those requirements for you to be eligible as a sponsor, one, and then eligible just to participate because you meet the statutory requirements for eligibility. The 250,000 acre limits and the 25,000 acre fee and the rural and ag benefits and all those types of things. You're stating that you're committed to meeting those requirements as well as your sponsor requirements and your cost share requirements, all those things. NRCS state offices, they will collect requests and work with our local state agencies to rank the requests. So, not necessarily every request that comes in may be decided to be forwarded to national headquarters for funding. You know, there may be some decisions to say, hey, you know what, we have 50 requests that came in this year. Do we actually want to submit 50 requests? Let's maybe submit the top 10, because in reality, can we manage at a state 50 requests? Most likely, probably not. You know, even 10 is difficult to manage in one given year if you're doing requests each year. So there needs to be some level of local ranking and consideration before requests are forwarded on to headquarters. So the next thing is that we work with our sponsors to develop a proposal for those funding requests. And those proposals are required in order to document more detailed specifics on what actually is being proposed here and what you're requesting specifically, so that we can rank all of the requests that come in equally and make a decision for funding. And then proposals are submitted to the national office. Ranking and funding decisions are made based on available funding, and then funding is distributed back out to the states. So once funding is distributed to the states, they're allocated out, and normally one phase is funded at a time. So if you're in a project that's new and you're requesting funding for planning, but you're also documenting a need for design and construction, well, just throwing out numbers just to make, you know, ballpark numbers. If you're requesting $1 million for planning, and let's say $2 million for design, and then $6 million for construction, well, we wouldn't necessarily give you $9 million to say, hey, go forth and do good for the next, you know, 8 years. No, we would definitely want to say, let's start off with that $1 million for planning if that you requested, if that's what you request. I'm just throwing out numbers, not saying that that's what your request needs to be. But if that's what you requested, then we would start with that. And then as you complete that plan as authorized, we want to move to that next phase of funding. And then once the funding is allocated, so we would fund that phase that you're ready for. And then we would enter into an agreement with the sponsor to complete the funded phase of work. And even that PIFR, or even that's included. If you want to just do that, you would enter into an agreement. Then the technical work may be completed by the sponsor or an RCS. So it's either way. The sponsor can do the work, or an RCS can do the work. But an RCS has responsibility for oversight of the work and then technical acceptance of that work. And RCS reviews and approve all the work that's done at every stage of the program. Now here, let's look at these timelines that I put at the bottom here. Let's kind of see that PIFR, that initial investigation, that preliminary report that's done. That PIFR should really only take about 6 months at max, to be honest with you. We have developed a template that we're going to be issuing to our states and providing training on how to utilize that template. But in reality, it should only take about 6 months at most. Sometimes you may be able to do it in much less time than that. The plan EA/EIS, depending on whether or not you're doing an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, and those are terms about NEPA documents. So when you're doing your planning, it's going to either be an environmental assessment, which is somewhat of a slightly moderate scale of investigation. But as you get to those projects that are more expensive and have more impacts and may require congressional approval and may have some sensitive species and some sensitive areas that are being impacted, you know, as you get to those plans where there may be critical impacts and it has a more wide scale reaching implication for it, we are more likely going to go into what's called an environmental impact statement. It's a much more detailed study to document the impacts of this particular plan. So either way, though, we're saying up to 18 months is on average what it would take for a plan EA or EIS. The average is about 18 months, and that's what the goal is for those. And then the design phase should take about 20 up to 24 months. Sometimes it may be quicker. Sometimes it may take slightly longer, but we're actually hoping to try to reach that ballpark of at least 24 months, no more, for that design phase. And then for construction, for this particular program, construction is on average about 2 to 5 years for construction. Many projects may be able to be constructed within 2 years or less. Some of them do take up to 5 years. And obviously, if you have a project with many phases, some phases may actually not get implemented immediately that are authorized, but so they may go beyond that 5 years. And that's all part of some of the other nuances of the program that we're not going to necessarily go into today. But this is more of an overview to say that on average, you should expect 2 to 5 years to at least complete what your first goal was to complete in that project. So those are some of the time limits and some of the things to think about with implementation. Now let's look a little bit closer at that planning part. So as I mentioned, for a plan EIS, that environmental impact statement, that very, very detailed study, we're saying that approximately between 18 months to 2 years, not 5, 18 months to 2 years, and maybe even longer sometimes if the plan is over $5 million. And most of the time when you're talking about an NEIS, it's probably going to be something over $5 million. And then if there's congressional approval required, which I had mentioned earlier, then you should expect 1 to 2 years, for that as well. And then the approximately 1 year if there's just an EA. And then environmental evaluations, we may do that in the rehab program, but not so much in watershed operations. But those could maybe only take 9 months for just an EE document. And then for some of the mandatory review time frames, so at different stages when you're starting to do your draft EIS or your final EIS or your record of decision, there are these timelines here that and by the way, you're going to have this slide so you can actually see this and digest it and read it and go through it when Dan and the National Watershed Coalition post this on their website. You're going to actually have that. And for NRCS folks, you're going to have it anyway because we're going to provide it out. So, but you can kind of digest this and see some of those required timelines that are in the law that are required for some of these different review timelines. And then so I wanted to kind of share a little bit more information on the documentation. So, and what's required. So this will help clear up some of the things that I stated earlier and maybe paint a real clear picture on what you should expect when applying for assistance. Now, everything you see on here is something that we're telling our state offices, hey, make sure you get this and submit to headquarters when you submit your funding request, right? But as a sponsor, some of these things you're responsible for making sure that our state office has in order for them to forward your request on for assistance. So if you're just requesting a planning update, what that means is there's already an authorized plan. This is a backlog project and it's an authorized plan and you just need to update the plan. Well, the sponsor requests for assistance to do that, as well as a plan of work and the estimate of a technical assistance needed to actually do that. So we always, you can see all throughout at every stage, we were saying a plan of work, a plan of work, a plan of work. Well, what do you plan? What steps need to take place? What tasks are going to be required? What is your schedule for getting these things required? So we want a clear, concise plan of work that actually shows you have a plan that you can execute to actually accomplish the work. So that's required. And that's something that our NRCS offices would actually develop. We've done some training on how to develop plans of work, and we can provide additional guidance and assistance as needed so that our state offices can make sure that their information is conveyed to us. And, so that's not something as a sponsor you need to worry about, how do I develop a plan of work? We've communicated to our NRCS program managers how that actually is done. And then if you're just doing a reaffirming of the feasibility, what that means is you have a plan that's been authorized. You don't necessarily know that you need to update it, but it's older, it's more than 5 years old. And you're going to go in and see whether have there been any land use changes or have there been any great major economic impacts or anything that has changed that would now make this plan not feasible as it was originally authorized 5, 6, 12 years ago, whatever, So you're going to do a reaffirming of feasibility. There's actually a process for that. It's a form we can fill out to actually go through, and that should only take about 3 months to do the reaffirming of feasibility. But if that's what a state wants to do and the sponsor wants to do, then that letter of request and then the plan of work and the TA request for that is all that's required. And that's the documentation required in order to get funding for that. And then for new planning. So if we're going to do new planning, this is a brand new plan. Nothing has ever happened before. This is that thought to say, hey, I got a new project. Let's go out and seek to get a plan authorized to do some work out here for this particular watershed. So first you need what's called a designated purpose. There's a form for that. It's not attached here, but this graphic that you see was a snippet out of the bigger presentation where that form is included. So we're presenting that to our staff as a documentation of the designated purpose and the form that you need to provide for new planning. So like I said, this is an internal NRCS type of thing. The preliminary investigation feasibility report, where our policy has always required a preliminary investigation report to be done. So we're still requiring that be done prior to any new planning being provided or accomplished. And then the SF 424, that sponsor letter request, the plan of work again, state agencies priority ranking, then the cost estimate. I see Ray chiming in. So do you want to ask the question now, Ray, or do you want to?
You've got a couple questions here. This could be your choice
Right.
on the EA, EIS business if you want to tackle those right now.
Okay, let's
This is golden. These last couple of slides, I know were really asked often, right, during our our registration. So thanks for covering these very much. Will there be a duplication of efforts if the EA and EIS determination of a plan when sponsors are faced with a Section 404 permitting? Why not work with the federal partners to accomplish the environmental assessment needs for plans to eliminate this potential duplication? So have you seen duplication, Kevin, in some of the EA, EIS determinations in Section 404 and et cetera?
Yeah, so there's a different purpose there. But and I haven't gotten to that slide just yet, but
Okay.
permitting is, but no, that's okay. We can answer this now. But permitting is one of the responsibilities that is the local sponsor's responsibility.
Mhm.
Now, there are some things that are being done at that planning phase that may be considered maybe a duplication or some of the efforts that are being done, but the purposes are different and the agency doing them are different, and it's at a different phase. So the NEPA planning EAEIS is done in the planning phase when you don't have an authorized project. Most of the Section 404 things are being done during that design phase when you're ready to go into actual construction and you're actually about to get that permit to actually implement the work. And at that point, you as a sponsor have to actually meet certain requirements, and we as a federal agency wouldn't necessarily be able to meet those permitting requirements for you. So there may be some efficiencies to be gained by the information provided, you know, and the information that has been documented. And there's obviously ways to capture some of those efficiencies. And I think that's more so what you may be kind of getting at there is how can we maybe streamline some of this to capture that same information in a way that when we're ready to request a permit for the 404, that the information is actually there and available to us as a sponsor in the same way that can be regurgitated. But the sponsor then has those responsibilities to make sure that they've done a thorough investigation and provide the information necessary to secure a 404 permit.
Okay.
So I wouldn't consider necessarily duplication of effort. I see them more so as two different purposes for two different agencies to accomplish the same work, but you can build off of one in order to fulfill the needs of the permitting phase.
Thanks, Kevin. And I've got just one more question, and we're going to go right back to your prepared remarks, and I'll hold the rest. And this one's related to EA, EIS analysis. What is the minimum percent complete that a design needs to be able to do that EA, EIS analysis?
Yeah, so and many times it's a very high cut design type of effort that's going on. And many times it may go up as high as maybe a 30% type of design. And it depends on certain types of well, it depends on, first of all, what the project is and what the purpose is. So there may be some level of more geotechnical type investigation, some type of maybe seismic analysis that's being done earlier on in the planning phase in order to accomplish some of that engineering necessary to support the completion of that EA or EIS. So, you know, you really shouldn't get, normally you wouldn't get beyond more than what's considered a 30% preliminary design normally for that purpose. And obviously, you know, as you move into design, you know, some of the work that was done in the initial preliminary investigation that was done for, and I use that term interchangeably because now I'm talking about a field investigation for engineering purposes, not for a report for PIFR, but some of that early on preliminary field work level investigation that was done may be more detailed studied in a design and further evaluated out in a design, but maybe like a 30% or so design at that planning stage normally is about where you're going to be on average. Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. Back.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's keep going. So I think I was at the new planning. So I'm going to kind of speed up here a little bit. I'm not worried though, because when we get to the next two phases, two programs, we're going to go a lot quicker because we're going to cover some of the same information and kind of make it a little bit more streamlined here. So let's get into the planning supplement. If you're just requesting a supplement of an existing plan, there's the forms there that you would need to have. This is for the Watershed Rehabilitation Program mostly. So a dam assessment has to be completed there, and then that planning work again. And then if you're going to complete supplements that are more than 5 years, you have to have that reaffirming of feasibility, as well as that request for assistance and the planning work. So now you kind of see a pattern there with design. Once you get into design, if you're going to just do a design, you have to have that completed plan or that supplemental plan completed and authorized before you can get into the design phase. So you want to have that done. And then if you're doing a reaffirming of feasibility of an existing design, you can do that, just a request for that assistance, and then the estimated TA and the plan of work for actually doing that. So what that means is I have a design out there. I have an authorized plan. I have a design. The design was completed, but we didn't go into construction. So now I want to make sure that design is actually still feasible as designed. and I want to go back and do some checks on it. Well, we can provide TA to the states to do that. So in order to do that, though, you have to have that request to do so, and then the plan of work of how you're going to actually execute that and accomplish that in a timely manner, and how much is it going to cost. And then construction, well, in order to request construction assistance, you have to have at least 90% design complete. So you don't have to have a full design complete, but you at least have to have completed 90% of your design. And then the land rights that has to be acquired, because you couldn't move into construction without land rights anyway. So proof of land rights, and then the plan of work and the technical assistance. The land rights really is kind of a stickler there, because we've gotten into a lot of projects that just simply can't move forward because of land rights issues. And we really want to make sure that before we commit federal funding for construction, that we really have a strong, firm commitment that we can get these land rights, and well, actually we've gotten the land rights and we're ready to move forward. So that's a real big one there, and we don't want to kind of tie up funds and then have to return them because we were not able to secure land rights. All right, budgeting. This is important. So for our sponsors, these are some things you want to know about budgeting. You must show evidence of committing for funding to install, operate, and maintain the project. So you must show evidence that you're able to commit to funding all of the necessary required installation in order to operate the structures and facilities that are installed, as well as maintaining them. NRCS doesn't pay for operation and maintenance. That's a sponsor responsibility. If you're going to have a local contract, you must show that you're either able to perform all the contracting for construction or request the NRCS perform it through a federal contract. So if you're going to actually do a local contract, a locally led one, you have to show that you're actually able to do that. So you're going to have to be reimbursed. So if you're being reimbursed for work, you're going to definitely want to make sure you're able to actually lay out, have outlays for those initial funds that are necessary to contract for the work to be done, and then start paying the contractor as they complete work in construction, and then be reimbursed by NRCS. You have to have funding available to do that. And then the sponsor must provide funds up front, and then, as I said, you're reimbursed for the project cost. And it may be 100% reimbursement. You just need to make sure you have funds to lay out initially, and then every 30 days or so, we're reimbursing you. Sponsors are not reimbursed for the following. So this is important. You're not reimbursed for acquiring those needed permits and licenses. We don't reimburse. That's a local requirement that you get the permits and the licenses. Operation and maintenance. You never reimburse for operation and maintenance. So those fees are local. And then technical services to implement that municipal industrial water supply, you're not reimbursed for those things. So that was one of the things that we had mentioned earlier, that you want to be mindful of, that you are aware of those expenses, and that you're able to actually cover those expenses if you choose to have municipal industrial water supply added to your project. And then sewer facilities in urban areas, we don't pay for that either. So you would not be reimbursed for that particular measure under the Watershed Operations Program. All right, so here's a good success story. This is a project out west in, out east in Massachusetts in the Northeast. This is a Cape Cod Water Resources Project in Barnstable County, Massachusetts. The sponsor was the Cape Cod Conservation District. Some of the issues that they had here were water quality degradation. Their anadromous fish populations had habitat had been depleted, and then they had pollution from stormwater runoff, and waterways had been in urban areas had been blocked from development. So they had a lot of different type of issues going on within this watershed, this critical watershed that was very pristine watershed at one point for fish and aquatic species, but it had been degraded. So some of the measures we installed were larger culverts. We put in fish ladders, we put in dry wells, sand filters, and the total NRCS cost for this project was about almost $24 million, just slightly under that. And then some of the accomplishments were that the porous pavement provided in Provincetown, you can see some of that being installed here, replace some of the traditional asphalt, and then it helped to reduce some of the stormwater runoff issues that they had. We were successful in installing fish ladders and increasing the shellfish population as well through the habitat restoration of certain types of aquatic habitats. So we were able to improve that as well. So I actually toured this site, and it was actually a very nice effort that was done there, and a very good project that was done by our sponsors there in Barnstable County, Massachusetts. So just a different type of project under Watershed Ops. No dams, just a bunch of different type of other land treatment type, and other structural measures to address the needed resource concerns. So now, watershed rehabilitation. So we're off of the first program. We're going to go through these next two programs much quicker than we did the first one, because we're going to regurgitate some things. So it's going to be a lot quicker. So let's buckle up and let's go through watershed rehab. So this program is only eligible if you're providing assistance to a dam that was built under that first program I just mentioned. That's under the authority of PL566, Public Law 78534, the Pilot Watershed Program, or the RC&D program. If the structure you're looking to rehabilitate was not installed under one of those four authorities, then you cannot do anything. Stop, don't press go. You're not eligible for the program at all. There's no waivers for that. There's nothing we can do about that. It has to be one of those programs. Priority is given to high-risk dams. So because we have over 2,000 high hazard structures in our portfolio of 11,480 structures, then the priority is given to those that are high hazard, and we have enough of those to carry us quite a while in order to get them rehabilitated. We've actually only rehabilitated 169 structures since 2001 in the 20 years of this program. So if you look at it, we have a long ways to go, and in 20 years we've only done 169 structures. So there's a lot of work to be done there. NRCS provide assistance for that assessment that's done, that initial assessment, the planning, design, and implementation assistance. Now the cost share, 65% of the total cost for rehabilitation is provided. That's the total cost. And the total cost does not include those things that the sponsor are responsible for. So it's 65% of the cost of those things that NRCS could cover. All right. And that's including the engineering services that we cover, including the planning that we cover. So it's the total cost. 65%. Now we cannot exceed, though, at that 65%, it cannot exceed 100% of the construction cost. So if you say, you know what, I'll do everything else, I just want NRCS to pay for construction. Well, then we'll just pay for 100% of the construction cost, provided that it's not 65% of the total cost, because you have to keep between those two numbers. So that's the caveat there, kind of balancing between those two numbers to make sure that you stay within the confines of both of them for the watershed rehabilitation program. As an overview, it is authorized under PL566 again, 11,840 dams, 1,271 watersheds since 1948. That's the history basically of the watershed ops program, right? That's the accomplishments of these structures that were done there in the previous program I just went through. But as far as aging dams, NRCS has structures that are aging and nearing their service life. And they also have structures that have noticed watershed development, land use changes, accumulation of sediment in the sediment pool, and then structural deterioration. All of those are reasons and things that will facilitate or prompt the need for a watershed rehabilitation project. All right, here's a little bit of the outline. So local sponsors request NRCS assistance, and then we do a dam assessment. We pay for that. We do a plan. We pay for that. We do a design. We pay for that. And then we'll participate in the construction process. Now, remember those cost share rates, all that applies here. It does not apply to the assessment. Technically, when you're doing the assessment, you're not really in the rehab program. It's just something that's required before planning. Or if you just say, you know what, let's skip the planning, let's just do let's skip the assessment, let's just go straight to planning. That is an option. We do encourage assessments though on all of our high hazard structures to make sure that we properly assess them. And for those 11,840 structures, many of them were actually constructed as low and significant hazard. NRCS inventories our structures and do inspections on those low and significant hazard structures basically every 5 years. And at that time, there may be a need for a hazard classification change. And when that happens, you'll notice that change, and we will then classify them as high hazard structures where we inspect them annually. And then if they were originally constructed as low hazard, we want to then enroll them in the rehab program as quickly as possible to get them up to meet current dam safety requirements and dam safety standards that they should meet. Benefits, we've benefited over 47 million people have been protected. Some of the purposes for rehabilitation include water supply. We'll pay up to 50% for increased water supply, or added water supply, not increased, but added water supply. We'll pay for sediment erosion control, public safety, flood protection, even recreation could be one of the purposes and benefits of the rehab program, and then wildlife habitat. So here's some statistics. So over 2,379 high hazard potential dams in our portfolio today, 7,000 1,728 have been assessed. So we have quite a few still to assess, under 1,000, but still quite a few. 261 dams have been authorized for implementation. And then 169 dams have actually been rehabilitated. And then 39 dams are in the design phase today. 111 dams are in the planning phase today. And then another 20 dams are actually currently in construction as we speak. So that's a picture of where we are, total of where we are for the watershed rehab program. So how do you apply? It's basically the same as what I showed you for watershed ops. You're submitting that request for assistance or that letter, including that same information that I shared earlier, who you are, what you're looking to do, what program you're applying for, how are you eligible, how are you going to meet those requirements. Those are the same things we stated earlier. And then you work with your sponsor, NRCS. We work with our sponsors to develop a rehab funding request. And there's a form that we have for NRCS state offices to fill out to complete that request and submit it through our request system and on our SharePoint to make sure that we get it. It's all done internally. So sponsors, you want to work with your local NRCS office to make sure that your request is submitted and that they'll populate the forms in the fields and submit it to the SharePoint. You wouldn't have access to the SharePoint. So someone from NRCS would have to submit that request for you on behalf of our state conservationists. Requests are submitted to the NRCS national office. They're ranked and then they are funded. I will say this, for the last few years, most requests that have come in for rehab, we've probably funded everything that has come in for the most part, because most requests that are come in have been within the resources that we have, and they've been ready for the phases that they've requested. So they've only requested what they're ready to do. And we were able to fund pretty much everything that's come in the last 3 years as it was requested for the most part. There have been some minor changes, but that was discussions between us and the state to say, hey, let's relook at some of these, and we revised it. Once a project is selected for funding, again, this is similar to what I said earlier. You're going to basically go into an agreement, and then that agreement is executed with the sponsor. NRCS provides technical oversight for that project still. We review at all phases. If you look at it, here's some of the different timelines though. So the assessment may take up to 12 months. So when we're doing those watershed assessments, we're asking states to certify and submit them within 12 months of funding of those projects. Now, I should have stated this earlier too, that these durations that we're talking about, that's from the day work starts, not the day you request assistance. That's from the day that the work actually begins. Like, you've got an agreement in place, you've gotten the monies obligated, everybody's ready to hit go. All the firms and engineers necessary to participate are there. All the technical resources are there. Now you start and put pen to paper, you step out on the ground in the field and you start surveying and doing whatever you need to do. And now the work has begun. After that, day one commencing work, then we're saying 12 months later, it should be completed. Now, one of the things we'll say though is for assessment, we don't want you to wait 6 months to get it in place. We are annually asking that those assessments are completed every year. So we're checking with states to make sure they're completed every year, and it doesn't normally take a year to complete an assessment. The EAEIS up to 18 months, the design up to 24 months, and then for construction, because these are rehab projects, they don't normally take that 5 years. You should be able to complete them normally, the construction, in about 3 years normally. Obviously, there are different instances when it goes over that 3 years, obviously. Budgeting, this is very similar to what I stated earlier. So just regurgitating some of the same information, making sure you have those funds up front because you are being reimbursed, and then making sure that the sponsor is responsible for their share as far as the local permits, as far as the operation and maintenance, any technical services that are required, and also your cost share, making sure that you are aware that you're not going to be reimbursed for your share of the cost. And that now you will be reimbursed for technical assistance that you provide. Let's say you participate on the design or something, you did it and RCS would have done it. You may be reimbursed for that if you don't want to count it towards your share. But so if you're not doing it for cost share assistance, you couldn't be reimbursed. Other than that, you're not being reimbursed for these things that are shown here. All right, a success story. This was a great project out west, out you guys' way in Wyoming, working with the folks in Johnson County, Wyoming, the Dull Knife Irrigation District. This Dull Knife project was one of the ones we recently completed in 2019. It was a project where we widened the spillway. It had an existing erosion auxiliary spillway that had actually a rock auxiliary spillway that actually eroded. And then we went in, we widened the auxiliary spillway for capacity purposes. We raised the top of the dam. Then we added riprap protection, and we also installed abutment drains. So these are some of the measures we did. It was about a $4 million project for NRCS cost, the NRCS cost of that. And then the accomplishments were that we provided protection for over 77 people and 21 residences, and 3 major roads were protected as part of the infrastructure protection. So this is a very great project. I'm looking forward to getting out there to Wyoming to see it. I actually haven't seen this one yet, but I'm excited for any opportunity I can to get out there and see it. So folks, if you're on from Wyoming, just let me know when you're ready and I'll be on a plane to get out there and check it out. Excuse me. All right. Oh man, get a sip of water here. All right. EWP. So I told you I was gonna go quick through rehab. So EWP is gonna be quick as well, but I do wanna state this. EWP is a little bit of a different program. EWP is, it does involve infrastructure, but this is normally repairing things that are in existence, not necessarily building new infrastructure, and then protecting infrastructure. So that's a little bit different. It's a recovery program as a result of a disaster. So to be eligible, private entities may only receive assistance through an eligible project sponsor. And that is that state government, that city, that town, that county or parish, some municipal authority, or a tribal organization. These project sponsors are the same project sponsors for all 3 programs. So just wanting to make sure you're aware of that, that if you're talking about any of these 3 programs, you're looking at the same list of individuals as far as eligible project sponsors. It has to be that private land or non-federal public land, or federal lands where there's a non-federal right-of-way. Basically, a non-federal organization has a right-of-way to do work or to operate and maintain some federal land and do things on our federal land. Overview: to provide local communities assistance to recover from a natural disaster. Some of these disasters you see here are common disasters, but as I mentioned earlier, we've actually done work with volcanoes, even recovery from volcanoes. We've done things where there have been sinkholes. You know, it's a number of different erosion type situations where you'll see a natural disaster, and we will come in and participate. You must, whatever is done, must reduce threats to life or property. It must. We can't do something that doesn't reduce a threat. If it's just repairing something and nothing, no benefit or threat reduction, we wouldn't participate. It must be economically, environmentally, and socially defensible. So whatever we do has to be defensible. We have to be able to stand by it. The cost cannot exceed the benefits. You know, so it has to have a positive cost benefit ratio, and we have to have something that's environmentally and economically defensible. We have what's called exigencies and emergencies. Those exigencies are those projects that could be temporary. You may come in and do a temporary repair and put in riprap to temporarily stabilize an embankment, and then come in later and do some more mechanized armoring of the system, or maybe a soil nail wall or something, or some other type of structural armoring to actually repair that embankment and put in some other measures to actually permanently repair and make sure that embankment will not fail again. So the exigency work may be temporary. It may be permanent. I've actually done some exigency work that turned out to be so good that it was actually eligible to be, it held up, so it could actually be a permanent fix. So we decided not to do an emergency project, the permanent fix, because the exigency was permanent. And then we provide recovery assistance and assistance through floodplain easements. However, I'm not going to talk about floodplain easements today, but I will say this, that a floodplain easement can be done also through the Watershed Operations Program. There's opportunities there to do floodplain easements as well in the Watershed Operations Program. Today, I'm only talking about recovery assistance, though, as it relates to the EWP program. So the outline is the disaster occurs. So after that natural disaster occurs, the NRCS would do like a electronic disaster report, like a rapid assessment of what the damages may be, and notify headquarters of that. And then the sponsors submit their written application for assistance to our state conservationists. And then the state conservationists will then determine if there's an exigency or an emergency, and then develop a damage survey report. Once those are completed and approved, NRCS will provide financial and technical assistance for those damage survey reports that are completed. Those damage survey reports are detailed reports that identify the damages. They identify, they include a CPA 52. So basically there's an evaluation of the environmental impacts of the measures that are proposed. Then they also include a cost benefit and analysis, so an economic analysis. And they also include the cost estimate, the engineer's cost estimate for the proposed measures to be done. And then we'll fund it based off of those proposed measures. Sponsors, here are your responsibilities. You're responsible to participate on the damage survey assessment team. So we want local participation with those DSR teams. You're responsible for securing land rights and for repairing in order to repair the work. You're responsible for those permits. That's the same as the other two watershed programs, land rights and permits, always a local responsibility. And then the local cost share. We're going to talk about that cost share here on the coming slide. And then administering local contracts. So if this is a locally led contract or a locally led project, I should say, then you would be responsible for administering that local contract to actually get the work done in construction. And then any necessary operation and maintenance. As a sponsor, you're responsible for that operation and maintenance. In all programs, we always provide an operation and maintenance plan. And when you sign off on that operation and maintenance agreement, you'll have that plan. And then that plan, you would execute that plan in the coming years to actually operate and maintain the facility that was installed through the watershed program. Federal cost share. So here's a look at the federal cost share. Our standard cost share is 75-25. If you look at a limited resource area, then we'll go up to 90% federal, 10% local. That includes, in order to be eligible for limited resources, you have to have your local housing values in that community. Normally it's like a county, is the defined community is normally a county or a parish. But in instances of tribal communities, we define tribal boundaries and tribal units of government for the limited resource areas. So we have definitions for that. And this is all actually on our EWP national website. You can go look this up. It's all there. But anyway, you have to have 75% of the housing values in that community less than 75% of the state average. Per capita income has to be below 75% of the state average. And then also unemployment has to be twice the US average of the last 3 years. So that's an additional requirement. In the event that you meet all three, you're automatically considered a limited resource area. We've identified those limited resource areas on our website, our EWP website. So you can go there now today and look. It's a public document that shows a map and a list of all of the limited resource communities and areas. So they're already known, right? But let's say you didn't make that list and you meet two of those three criteria. You can request through your state conservation as a waiver of that LRA criteria, and then a justification for why you should still be considered for that 90% cost share. And then we would work with the states to provide either approval of that waiver or some response to document whether or not we're going to be able to approve that waiver because you met at least two of those criteria and didn't quite meet that third, but there's some circumstances by which you still need to be reconsidered. And we can do that. We can provide a waiver. And then at that point, you're receiving the 90% cost share. How to apply, same process. Basically, you submit the 424 application for assistance or a letter. So it could be all documented in a letter. Then sponsors work with us to develop the DSR. And then the DSRs are reviewed and approved for funding and submitted to headquarters. So as far as implementation, so the implementation, most of the top text is the same. So you go through the agreement process similar to what we described before. Exigencies are normally completed in 10 days. However, we've given the authority that state conservationists can extend those exigency projects, and the performance time can go up to 90 days from the date the disaster occurred. So that gives you an additional window of time where the state conservationists can say, all right, 90 days from the date the disaster occurred, I can extend this contract up to that 90-day deadline, whatever that 90 days out is, whatever that date is. Now, I will say this, normally there's a time limit, not the performance time limit, but a different time limit that says 60 days after the disaster or the site is accessible, you have to have your request submitted. So sponsors, you got 60 days to submit your request. Then NRCS says 60 days to do DSR. Well, if we take that 120 days, we're already outside or past that 90 days. So it's incumbent upon you to say, hey, let's get these requests in as soon as possible, immediately. Then let's get the DSRs completed immediately. The most access that we can to any performance time extensions up to that 90 days after the disaster occurred. Then the emergencies, they're 220 days normally, but we've given the authority for state conservation to extend them up to 18 months after the date of the event occurring. So, the date of the event, the disaster occurred, then you have 18 months. That's still that 60-day window is still there, so that 120 days is there. But you want to cut as much of it as possible so that you don't have to deal with that request period and get those requests in as soon as possible and get those DSRs completed as soon as possible so that you can take full advantage of those performance time extension periods. Budgeting, very much similar to what I presented at first. Not a lot different here on budgeting. Just knowing that you are responsible for those costs up front, and then NRCS will take care of the reimbursement of those. Here's a great project in Harris County, Texas. We were able to complete for EWP. Worked with the Harris County Flood Control District from the 2017 Harvey storm. The stream bank erosion and flooding that had occurred as a result of that hurricane. We went in and installed some measures for stream bank stabilization. It's about a $2 million project here. You can see all the sheet pile that was installed. There was some riprap placed as well, and some other hydraulic control structures installed. We reduced the risk of flooding for over 30 structures in the 1% floodplain, and created depth so that we could restore the effective drainage to that area and protect those nice, beautiful Texas homes that you see there in the background, as well as some of the other roads and other infrastructure out there. This was a very successful project we were able to complete with our friends in Texas, and a very successful story. All right, so I tried to go through that pretty quickly. Wanted to get to some questions and answers now and get into our listening session and get some feedback from you. So at this point,
Sounds
if there are
great,
any questions-
Kevin. Very, very good. And we're right up against time. Take a couple of questions here and ask you, and then
Okay.
we're going to go on a break and give you a break, give the folks a break, get up and get around a little bit, and we're going to dive right into a bunch of questions and these folks' recommendations on how to actually improve the programs that you spoke about today. So if you're ready, I'm gonna share screen here and
Let's do it.
come on back in just a bit. If you will give over the screen back to me, that would be great.
Oh, okay.
That's awesome. Thank you.
All right.
Here we go. So the question that I'll pose to you first, which seems right in the middle of the EWP, and it's this one. It's how about EWP? Can it be done on only on privately owned lands, or can it be also on state lands, county lands, local government lands?
Yeah, so it's basically only on private owned lands. There are some opportunities where if there are local lands owned by let's say state agencies, there are some opportunities to do some work, but the real prohibition there is on federal lands. So there are some limiting opportunities there for state-owned lands, but the focus is mostly on private-owned lands. But there are some opportunities, especially when you start talking about the easements and restoration and things like that. You definitely could do that on the state lands. And then there's some other smaller recovery projects that we could also do on state lands. So there's an opportunity there for state lands. Yes.
Thanks so much. This one's kind of an interesting one. The individual gave us quite a bit of thought here about governing regulations, allowing NRCS assistance, EWP practices associated with the removal of public health and safety benefits, restoration of natural environment. But the essence of the question, I think, is here. Can you prioritize, for example, and improve upon, right, a condition, replacing damaged road crossings so that they not only replace the existing design, put it back the way it was, but also improve that stream function by increasing the size, yada, yada, yada. What do you think?
Yeah, so that question has come up a lot. So our policy is that we will not pay for improvements that are not required to meet a current standard. So if the standard has changed and the design standard has changed that are a regulatory requirement requires an improvement upon the structure, then we would obviously pay for the full cost of that because you have to meet the permitting requirements.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's a requirement there, we would definitely pay for that. But if the sponsor just says, you know what, I just don't like these particular structures, they're too hard to maintain. I just want to make it bigger, and I just want to do this, and so that additional enhancement of that structure would be at the sponsor's cost. So we're still paying what we agreed to for what NRCS would have designed and paid for. But if you want to go above and beyond that, for solely for your purpose and not because it's required or in order to permit it or something, or if it doesn't necessarily is required, not necessarily for to meet a standard design standard, if that's just a choice or a preference, then no, we wouldn't pay for that preference. It would be solely at the sponsor's cost for that upgrade, and that upgrade may only cost you 10% more, but that 10% you would just have to bear the the cost at 10%. you still have all the benefits of saying, all right, NRCS is paying for the contractors to come out and do the work. But the difference of what it costs now than what it would have cost, we're going to just pay the difference.
Very good. Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate that
Mhm.
clarity. And how about an average conservation district? Could they function as a sponsor in a new construction project? Thought maybe that could
Oh,
be.
absolutely. Yeah. And I am assuming this is talking more about watershed optimal than EWP, but absolutely. We have several conservation districts that serve as sponsors, and they've done so, for over 70 plus years working with this program. I do understand, though, that nowadays you're talking with districts and sponsors who may be, I guess, more limited as it comes to resources, financial resources. So it may become a little bit more difficult. But you have the authority to do it. It's just a matter, I guess, of some of the funding necessary to actually accomplish and carry out those functions. And that's something you want to identify early on. We're covering the cost for planning and design and all those types of things. But if you're not able to operate and maintain the structure, we need to have that discussion early on and develop ways to, look at how can you secure resources to be able to actually operate and maintain these structures, and then also covering your permitting costs and land rights costs and all those types of things.
Hey, speaking of that, here's a question right here. And I'm gonna two more questions, then we're gonna send everybody off on a break, including you, Kevin, to get a breather. The USACE couldn't USACE be asked to be a cooperating agency during planning?
Absolutely. Any federal agency could be a cooperating agency. It could be the Bureau of Reclamation,
Yeah.
BIA. It could be any federal agency, could be a cooperating agency in the development of a watershed plan. And that's actually a wise decision to do so. So yes, any federal agency could be a cooperating agency during the planning phase, and it's encouraged.
Okay, and let's go to the next one. You can read it there, Kevin. How is information provided to sponsors regarding the separation of costs for acquiring necessary permits and the other items listed that aren't payable on that slide that you gave us, which is golden, by the way. That's so informative. Sponsors tend to lump their permit applications into their planning hours.
Yeah. So the permitting that we're really talking about, there's a permitting at the construction phase. Now, if there's some permits at the planning phase, they wouldn't necessarily be things that we're discussing. We're talking about permits for implementation. So if you're looking at something just for planning prior to implementation, that is a local permit requirement, it may be something that we can reconsider and say this is something local. But if you're talking about a permit that's acquired at the planning phase in order to construct, which sometimes does happen, then obviously if it's for the purpose of construction, then we would not want to pay for that. You would have to identify that as a cost. So here's how we would do that to answer your question. In the agreement phase, when we actually structure the agreement for what services are being provided and what cost share is being provided by NRCS, we would spell out and identify each one of the things that we are paying for. And it would include engineering services for the development of a plan, let's say, and it would include services to do site and field investigations. It would include review time and different things of that nature. And then if it was a different phase, we would itemize and line out every single phase of work that is being completed and every task to be completed, and then who's responsible for that task and what cost share each entity is responsible for, whether it's a federal agency being NRCS or you as a local sponsor. So we're going to itemize those costs in a cost estimate, and it's going to be attached to the statement of work that's provided in the agreement. And then you'll see actually what we're paying for and what you're paying for. And if you have a permit that's not identified in that statement of work, that's something that NRCS would pay for, then up front, we're saying up front that that's not something that's eligible for payment reimbursement.
Outstanding. Wow. We have some outstanding material yet to share with you, and including some of the registration items that you gave us, your questions that you gave us in registration. Those were just a sampling of what we were sharing with you regarding the questions that came in during the course of the presentation. So again, we're going to be working on the program questions and answers when you come back from your break. Two parts of this afternoon's activity. One is to answer the questions that were provided in the registration and also during the webinar. The second part of that, though, is for recommendations that you have to improve the watershed programs. So again, I've pleaded with you, grab out a piece of paper and pencil and get ready to write down that one recommendation that you have that Kevin and his staff can consider out of our listening session portion of this, which is both questions and discussion and so forth. I'm going to move to some of the registration questions. I'll move back, Kevin, in a bit to some of the questions that we had during the webinar. But I think there are some here that you certainly want to talk about. What assistance can NRCS provide during the application phase? And we may have muted you somehow. There we go.
Oh, sorry. Now I said my best stuff then.
Yeah, I bet you did.
Okay, so some of the application, not a lot of assistance from NRCS because it's just information that you're filling out as far as the letter of request. But beyond that, when you start talking about the proposal and actually getting into the documents that we require to review here at headquarters, a lot of that is, somewhat led by NRCS. We're helping to develop those proposals, and we're providing guidance to the sponsors on what needs to be in that proposal.
Mm-hmm.
We're providing guidance to the sponsors on how to, come up with the budget that needs to be provided in there to make sure that the budget that you're submitting lines up with what we're looking for. And then, and kind of prioritizing, making decisions. If a sponsor has multiple requests, the state office may be able to say, or the NRCS office may be able to say, hey, you know what? Maybe we don't want to do all 3 of these requests right now. Maybe we only want to do 1 or 2,
Yeah.
And so making some of that pre-ranking decision, also you can get guidance from NRCS on how to do it. And as far as answering questions about eligibility, are you really eligible for this program? And what should I do? Should I be applying for assistance to get a PIFR done, a preliminary investigation feasibility report? Should I be applying for assistance to do a supplement to an existing plan? All those questions about what type of assistance I should be seeking, those are things that NRCS will be able to help you with.
Okay. Questions in particular, huh? Okay. Okay, good. How about a typical timeline to complete the project? Now, I know this is duplication with purpose. You had a nice slide on that, and but just for the sake
so
in here.
That typical timeline. So as we had mentioned, if you're going to do a watershed ops project, that preliminary investigation feasibility report should be about 6 months for that particular program, for that report. If you're going to do a plan, then a new plan would take up to 18 months, depending on the complexity, size, and scope of the plan. And then a design may take up to 2 years for that watershed ops, and then the construction may be 2 to 5 years for construction. And then for rehab, an assessment, we're asking that they be completed annually. So within 12 months, that assessment should be done. And that is 12 months from funding. So, I said everything else is 12 months. I mean, everything else is like basically when your feet hit the ground. But we fund those annually. And each year we're asking that they be completed annually. So that's a little bit different. And then for a plan for rehab, it'll be that 18 months again. And then that supplemental plan will be 18 months. And then that design will be about 2 years again for rehab. But that construction will be between 2 to 3 years. Now, if there is just let's say a planning update or a reaffirming of feasibility, let's say, well, that reaffirming of feasibility should only take a few months to do the reaffirming of feasibility. Then you turn around and come back and ask for assistance to do the planning update, which may be that, 6 months to a year, if not longer for that.
Okay, thanks. Now, this again may be a repeat of some of what you talked to us about during the presentation, but how do we start that process from the ground up?
Yeah, so for watershed operations, I would say the way you want to start that process is the preliminary investigation feasibility report. So you want to go out and basically assess what do you have, and do a report on what the condition is, what the resource concerns are, what are some alternatives to addressing those resource concerns, what are some limitations we may be faced with, what are some potential impacts we may have. Is it really eligible? Just doing a baseline eligibility survey to say, hey, do we meet all the statutory requirements? Do we have eligible sponsors? Is there potentially a funding issue that may come up? Is there potentially a public perception and acceptability issue that may come up? And some of those things may lead to determine, maybe we don't want to go further. Well, everything may point to go. So at that point, if you get to the preliminary investigation feasibility report and everything says go, then you want to immediately move into planning. And so in order to do the planning, obviously you're going to look to be reimbursed at that point for planning. So the preliminary investigation feasibility report, there was no reimbursement necessary because that's not the responsibility of the sponsor. So you're not paying for anything there. But for the planning, even though you're not paying for it, you are being reimbursed for planning. So you want to make sure that you you act accordingly on that part. And if you're going to leave the planning, you do that. Then you move into your design once that plan is authorized. Once again, remembering that timeline that I just laid out. And then once the design is being completed in phases, you're going to do reviews on that. There's also reviews for planning. I failed to mention. So at the planning stage, there is a review, initial review. Once you're complete the initial planning, then we work with our National Water Management Center, who provides technical review and oversight for that purpose. And once that initial plan is completed, and then it'll be sent back, and then there may be some opportunities for review and comment and discussion on that plan. And then there'll be a disposition of any comments that are made and any edits to the plan. And then it's sent forward to NRCS headquarters office, our watershed program branch, to then review and consider for authorization for the chief's authorization. And then when the chief is ready to authorize it, it would then go out for public comment and review to make sure that you're able to address any, local state comments. Any NRCS issues first. And then when you go out for the public comment, you would send it back and then submit everything up to be completely authorized and publish your ROD and everything, and then have everything ready to go. So, and that time frame, may take the review time, sometimes may take 30 days on some of the reviews, sometimes a little bit longer, but on average about 30 days for the reviews.
Okay. Excellent news. Thank you. So what can a consultant do to help connect the sponsors in need with this project at a federal and state level? You got some consultants out there. Some of them are on the phone with us. Some of them are on the webinar with us today. And what can they do?
Yeah. So, all hands on deck approach is what I like to call it. And it's really good to have as many hands make light work, they say. So, when consultants are out there and they know what it is that we do, and you can help do some outreach, it's good to have you on the phone because, if you can communicate to some potential sponsors and you know who those eligible sponsors are, hey, you know what? I know a federal program that you may want to participate in, and explain to them what it is, even provide a link to our website or our brochures, and then say, hey, you know what, here's a local office, here's NRCS folks you might want to talk to, and connect them with us. So the thing that the consultant is doing is first is the outreach. And an educated consultant is good because you know what you're telling them. And you're almost like an extension of NRCS saying, hey, this is the eligibility for the program. This is the nuances of the program. Here's how you get assistance. Here's what it would do for you. Here are the benefits, and you can do that. And then as you're bringing those sponsors to the table, you want to introduce them to our local NRCS offices. And then if they're going to decide to then do a plan or anything or move to a PIFR, at that point, we work with them and kind of move them through those different phases. But I think any opportunity to outreach to a consultant and present NRCS watershed programs as a different alternative or opportunity to address something that you're already working with them on, or to assess a need, I think is something that a consultant want to have in their toolbox to say, hey, this is another opportunity for you to address something that we are working with you on to address.
Excellent. Thanks, Kevin. Take a breath, grab a drink of water there. I want to make sure I take care of my main person here and not overwork you too badly. We're going to be grabbing some others off the questions area too in just a bit. Let's take on this one though. We're staying with the planning, right? What resources are available to guide us through the process of developing a watershed plan? And are there examples of those plans that have been developed that would be available to?
Excellent question. So one of the things I want to highlight is that we are actually in the process of developing some sample plans. So now in 2018, we developed a decision memo and made the decision as an agency that we're going to move away from, we're just going to make the decision to implement the principles, requirements, and guidelines for water resources planning. So as a federal agency, that is somewhat of a different process in the way we approach planning, and it allows us to tap into some different accounts for the economic evaluation and some of the other evaluation of the proposed benefits and alternatives. So it allows us to do some of that. So with that in mind, what we've decided to do was we are requiring that states utilize PRNG for recently funded new planning opportunities. So what we did was we developed about 6 or so, we're in the process of development, let me say, about 6 or so template plan examples that would have instructions and answer typical, common questions that may come up in the development of the plan, and say, hey, these are some things that you would want to do, and this is how you would actually develop a plan under PRNG, because that's what we're requiring now. So it's going to be laying out everything that you would need to include in a plan. So it's a template sample plan, really, not even a template. It's really a sample plan. And it's actually filling out everything in the plan. It's a complete plan. And we're going to have about 6 examples of those for land treatment practices, for rehabilitation, for those structures, including plans, including dams, all different types of different scenarios there. So we're going to include those as some examples of what you want to do and what to expect as a guide to developing your plan.
Okay. So Amy's got her hand raised, and what I'm going to suggest, Amy, go ahead and drop it in the chat box, and I'll be able to grab that in a bit if you don't mind. That'll be great. Thank you so much. With 108 folks, if we open it up, we'll have a bit of an issue here with trying to get to everybody's verbal question and verbal answers. So here's one. Let's grab this one and make sure. Who prepares the preliminary investigation feasibility report?
Yes, that preliminary investigation feasibility report is primarily NRCS's responsibility to develop, right? So, and it's to help our state conservations be informed. So with that preliminary investigation feasibility report, even though we're developing it, the sponsor can participate, but it's primarily NRCS's responsibility to develop that, and that's why we're paying for it. So that's an internal document to aid us and to guide us. It's different from the assessment in rehab. In rehab, that assessment is developed and provided to the sponsor to help guide them in making a decision on whether or not to participate in our program. But they accomplish basically the same thing. It's directed at informing the sponsor for that assessment, but this one is directed more so towards informing our state conservations and their decision making. But the principle is still the same. Your overall document that, in this instance, NRCS is developing to inform our state leaders on how to make that executive decision as well to move forward in planning.
Second part of that individual's question was, is the development of that, do you do a group of the multiple PIFRs at the same time or at one time?
So, yeah, you would not want to do more than one preliminary investigation feasibility report for a anticipated plan. So if you're going to do one plan or one watershed that may end up being broken into multiple plans, even, you're probably going to do one PIFR, but there's nothing wrong with saying I have 4 watersheds across the state that are autonomous watersheds that, separate issues even. And I need to investigate the feasibility of doing a planning effort in each one of them. Well, then obviously, yes, you would want to do 4 separate PIFRs. And there's nothing at all wrong with doing all 4 of them at the same time. I would actually highly encourage that, because at that point you would have the decision to be able to decide which ones you want to move into planning first, if it points towards planning is the right alternative, if this is feasible.
That seems to be a central theme here with the PIFR, so let's stay with it, right? Is there a limit on how they can spend on that feasibility report?
There's a limit, or I should say there's an estimated amount to what we would expect it to cost. So we're providing guidance on what it should include. So like for an assessment, we're providing roughly about $20,000-$25,000 for an assessment. For the PIFR, it may go up slightly above that, but we would not, expect a PIFR to be more than $100,000 or so. That's getting excessive for what you're trying to do. It would probably be closer to that 20, 30 some thousand, and maybe a little bit more than that. But, it's not a report that needs to cost, it's not a plan, it's a report. So, it should be in the tens of thousands of dollars, not the hundreds of thousands of dollars type of an approach.
Okay. Tens of thousands. Okay. How about the guidance document that you made reference to during the discussion? Will the guidance document be available to sponsors?
Are you referring to the one for the plan development? I'm trying to remember which one I mentioned. So I'll just say this. but the sample plans, they will be posted
Mhm.
and they will be available for sponsors. So
Mhm.
I'm not sure if I mentioned a different one. I probably mentioned a couple others. Any additional guidance on how to actually submit your proposals and your request for assistance, that's normally provided directly to our state offices.
Mhm.
And because, that's who we're actually interacting with and asking to develop those requests for assistance. So uh, I'm really suggesting that you work directly with the state offices on that in order to get what you need in order to develop your request or, any assistance needed. So we're not necessarily posting it on a website. Now, if you have a recommendation where there's a certain type of guidance you need, please, when that time comes in this chat, make it known that this is something that we need. But if I'm not answering your question, also take time in that chat to express with more clarity on what you want, and so we can answer that.
Thanks. All right, hang on one second. Let me take care of a couple of things here.
Okay.
Move over to that, hit the meeting controls. I'm going to go over here and let's grab another question here that came into the chat, and I'm going to go back up and some folks are putting in the questions, some putting in the chat. So we're going to have a few different places to go and look for things, but we can do that.
Yeah.
How about, are project agreements required for the rehabilitation projects?
Yes. So I think what you're referring to, and the reason I say I think is because sometimes folks use those terms interchangeably.
Yes.
I think you're talking about the agreement for, well, you may be talking about the watershed agreement or the agreement for what we will actually do for this to implement this plan. And there's an updated agreement that is signed by the sponsor that is required, and it's signed by NRCS, and it is an agreement on what we do, that watershed type agreement. Now, when you look at the cooperative agreements or those project agreements that are necessary to actually do the work, those agreements aren't necessarily required if you're going to do all the work yourself. You don't necessarily have to have an agreement with NRCS to do the work. If you're oh, I'm sorry, let me back up. I'm misstating a little bit of it. So if we're going to do all the work, you don't necessarily have to have an agreement. I think I said if you're going to do. If we're going to do all the work and it's a federal contract, there may not be necessarily a need for an agreement if there's a federal contract, because there is no reimbursement and there is no responsibility on your side with the exception of your cost share. So now at that point, because there's a cost share, that would be the one thing that does facilitate or prompt an agreement for you to cover your share of the cost, but it wouldn't have any specific technical items that you're responsible for if NRCS is covering that. So to answer your question, if you're talking about a watershed type of agreement that's saying that this is what we are going to do in this project, yes, that's required, an updated watershed agreement. And if you're talking about that cooperative agreement that, or that actually it's a contribution agreement at that point, if you're talking about that contribution agreement that we're doing with the sponsor in order to actually complete the work, it's generally going to be required because you got a cost share. So you're going to not really have an opportunity to avoid that. So yes, you're still going to have an agreement required. So overall, yes, is the answer to that. Yes, an agreement is required.
Excellent. Well, let's roll back just a bit on this one. What is the ETA, expected time of arrival, for the example plans that you made noted of there?
Yeah, so we are planning to have those completed by the end of July for the completion of those plans. And then once we've reviewed them and made sure that everything is there, we would want to roll them out. And I would say by early August, they should be rolled out and available to everyone. The first draft of the first one should be here in 10 days. And like I said, we've just started this process a couple of weeks ago to actually initiate the work to getting these plans developed. These sample plans developed, and the goal was to have them completed in about a 6-week turnaround or so for most of those plans. And then by the end of July, we should have like some final products that we could start rolling out. And then in August, you would see some of those start to roll out.
Excellent, excellent.
Actually, most of them should be out by August. That's just most of them.
Pretty tight time frame, all things considered, huh?
Yeah.
So can the project proposed address only one of the purposes, or does it need to touch on all of the purposes of that you outlined in your presentation?
Yeah, no, it can be a single purpose type of a project. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily encourage it solely, to have you want to look at everything that, every issue out there that you're trying to address, and then narrow it down to those key purposes. So it may be one or two purposes, and sometimes maybe even three purposes. But no, you're not trying to do all 9 purposes for sure. And then beyond that, you're not required to do all the purposes. But I would suggest that if there is a need for more than one of those purposes to be addressed, then I would encourage you actually to try your best to address multiple purposes as needed to address the resource concerns that are out there. So, if given the opportunity, I wouldn't suggest a different plan just to do ag water management when I have a flooding issue here. You can do that. There's nothing wrong with saying you do that, but I just wouldn't necessarily encourage it as a first alternative. When you're in planning, you may want to just go ahead and address everything you can in that a watershed that's relevant and address multiple purposes at one time. Like I said, on average, you may see typically 2 or 3 purposes addressed in a plan. Sometimes you may only see one, but you're definitely not going to see all 9. I don't remember any that I've seen with 9 purposes.
Well, kind of interesting too, if we polled the folks that are on the webinar today and asked them, hey, how much time was spent, and would you have added a resource issue or something if you spend that much time, over that period of time working on this, you might just as well go for what it is needed in that watershed and not
Yes.
pull back, huh? Because you're going to be investing a bucket load of time and money actually in this work, regardless of which of the 3 programs, right? That
Yes.
is involved. Okay.
Yes, and I guess, like you say, you're trying to direct it, so obviously you don't want to have too many purposes that takes the focus off the main issue, obviously.
Right.
But at the same time, you don't want to miss some things that would have been good to have done in that particular plan.
So while we were addressing that one, I moved back to the registration questions. So I'm back to those, and some of which you knew, and some of which, Kevin, you and your staff did a wonderful job in preparing comments, right, in your presentation. So here's one from the potential sponsor asking a question: until construction is complete, how much time would it take for complete a new dam?
Yeah. So if it's brand new, you're looking at that possibly 8-year period that I talked about. If you're just talking about a dam, you're looking at that first, 1 year to 18 months for a plan. And now a plan is going to include more than one dam. Normally, you're going to have multiple structures in a plan. It wouldn't really probably be for one dam for the most part. So that plan is completed. And then the design 2 years later. So you're almost at 4 years there, 3.5, but almost 4 years there. And then you're 2 to 5 years. So, if you say on average, let's say, well, it's 3 years. So then you're around 7 years right there, and possibly even 8 years if everything went perfectly. Yeah. That's everything going perfectly. So, that's the realistic ideal, I would say, if you want to look at what it would take to get that done. Yeah.
How about the PL566 program? I think they're referring to the watershed operations again. Used for agricultural storage reservoirs. How about that?
Yes, so that could be a purpose could be for agricultural water management, and you could have a reservoir for storage of water for agriculture uses, whether it's for irrigation or for livestock watering or whatever purpose. But yeah, you could have a new structure that is being utilized for agricultural storage. I'm assuming that's what they were talking about more so than they were talking about, let's say, manure management type structure where you're looking at storage of like a lagoon or some storage, which you could do that just as well. I mean, if you're looking at a structure where you're doing a nutrient management type of a practice and you're storing ag waste, like an ag waste facility, and that is a different practice, but something like that could be accomplished in the same program. But here, I'm pretty sure when I see the word storage reservoirs, I'm pretty sure you're talking about a reservoir used for water supply and water usage for ag water management. So, but both of them could be done.
Could be a lot of dairies or animal facilities in one.
Yeah, it could.
Watershed,
it could.
I suppose. I mean, you
yeah,
don't
and not having the opportunity to hear the person talk. So I'm like, well, let's make sure I'm addressing the full part of it, and I'm interpreting your question to the fullest.
Excellent. Hey, what projects are most likely to receive funding? And I'm sure there's 3 very distinctly different platforms in there.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. Yes, and that is an excellent question. So when you start looking at projects that will receive funding, projects that are ready for the phase to, to be implemented are those that will most likely receive funding. If there is a PIFR, let's say for watershed operation, well, first of all, let me back up, Ray. So before you type too much, I'm going to give something I didn't provide. And that is one of the things that we've done is we've kind of revamped the way requests are being addressed in the funding process. So what that means is we're doing more of a rolling funding for all of our programs. EWP was already like that. We're funding requests as they come in. Watershed Rehab, we do have a funding request period that ends on June 30th of this year. However, moving forward, we're going to have more of a rolling request period that as funds are available, we're going to actually fund different projects as those requests come in. And then for Watershed Ops, this year, we're actually starting that process where as requests come in, we've created a new form and a new request. And that's part of the document form you saw me put in the presentation that's required, those required documents as part of a larger presentation that we put together to show folks once we roll this out of how those requests will be submitted on a rolling basis. So as you make those requests at any time, we'll be able to satisfy them, not just twice a year or when a request period comes out, but anytime. Now, with that being said, though, there's still a methodology behind funding decisions and even funding requests that are rolling in. So even though you may be submitting requests at any time, we still have to make a decision. Like if all requests came in for, let's say one state submitted 6 requests for construction, well, that may take up all the money right there on day one with one state submitting requests for 6 construction projects. Well, you wouldn't want to do that, so you can't use up all the money in one, opportunity there. So what we would want to do is have a methodology and some time and some thresholds on different phases on when we would fund certain amounts of funding, even by region, and kind of put some metrics in there so that we don't exceed certain thresholds early on, so that funds are there later on to kind of disperse out throughout the nation as it needs to be, even by phase. So that's the first thing. That's like a methodology type of thing. But beyond that, in making a decision for funding, we always want to say, okay, is this ready? If you're looking to do planning, are you ready to do it? And then one of the best ways to say that you're ready and that the sponsor is responsive, and this is a good, this is something we know can happen, is to first show that you've done a preliminary investigation feasibility report. That would have at least said that this is a good decision to move into planning. And then as you're ready to go into planning, are you able to commit the resources and the personnel and the time and the financial commitment to actually move it through the planning process? You have a documented plan of work that is strong to show that I know the tasks that I'm going to need to complete. Here are the time limits, here are the resources and the staff and the personnel necessary to complete that. And I've got a solid plan on how I'm going to actually accomplish this work, right? And that those projects that have a solid plan, that have a solid budget, that have a preliminary investigation or some type of a feasibility assessment to say they're ready to go, and they can show that they don't have an excessive workload somewhere else. So one of the things we look at is, all right, I'm making a request for rehab, but do I have also 6 requests for watershed ops and 5 EWP projects going on, and then I'm also already behind in 3 other projects here? Those are some of the things we want to look at. So it's the ability to manage the workload, So so those are some of the things we look at when you start talking about which projects will most likely be funded. It's those projects that we can make a best evaluation of, is the sponsor and NRCS capable of moving it forward within the time frame allotted. Now, if you got 6 or 7, 8 requests coming in and you really can't manage all of them, those things come into play. In addition to that, experience. If a sponsor is coming in with very little experience, we try to give everybody at least 1 or 2 projects they can work with, But if you're coming in and no watershed experience at all, and you're wanting to take on some real big project and you haven't done a solid feasibility report, well, at this point, we kind of addressed that because we're requiring those feasibility reports. But at one point, we had people coming in requesting projects, and there really hadn't been a good, I'd say, evaluation done to determine if this is the project I want to move forward. And I have no experience of doing watershed work at all. That did give us a little pause at sometimes. We said, what, we got to figure out a way to work with this sponsor to kind of help gradually move them into the program. So
have that preliminary report done, show
yes.
that you've got the people lined up and the things lined up
Yes.
to get going. I suppose the letters of support and things like that, and demonstrated work that you've done with the NRCS, the local
Yes.
and state staff and area staff, right? Those are important
Yes.
things. Okay.
Yeah,
Hey,
and just so I can add, if there's a new sponsor or someone, we're not going to say you're out the game. So if there's a new sponsor or someone coming to the table who's new to this, we're going to work with you to make sure we provide an opportunity for you to get into what we're doing as
okay, good. How about cost sharing with other federal sources and how that
well.
affects the required match and et cetera? Yeah.
I love that question. So on the surface, I'll just answer it real quickly. You can't use federal dollars to cost share federal programs. That's on the surface, right? Right off the bat. So you cannot use other federal funds to cost share watershed operation projects. Now, there is a caveat to that.
Okay.
So the caveat comes in here. There's different programs, and the one that I'm most familiar with, I think, is the Small Business Administration offers the CDBG grants, the Community Development Block Grants. And I've worked with those in the past, and some of you probably are familiar with those. Well, those CDBG funds are actually federal funds. They're provided to the local community. But sometimes when those funds come to the community, the appropriations and the authorization language for those funds say explicitly that they can be used for federal match or to match other federal funds. So when that language is explicitly used and stated that this local communities are receiving these grants to be used as match for other federal programs, then we could in those instances accept those funds because they are documented and approved and authorized for that purpose of being matched for a federal project. That doesn't happen a lot, and it definitely doesn't happen a lot in watershed ops. I've seen it in EWP, but not necessarily watershed ops. So it would be a very rare instance if it happened, but I did say it's a caveat and it is a possibility of it happening. It can happen. I think one of the bigger opportunities may be like if you were to do a loan or something, to cover the local cost share and to do a federally subsidized loan, we obviously work with rural development and other organizations to do loans, and that could help cover the local share through a loan, but it wouldn't be a federal match. It would be a loan.
I suppose we have situations too where a federal, Bureau of Reclamation, for example, you can separate parts of the overall project and be the Bureau of Reclamation pays for X amount, or even the Bureau of Indian Affairs or list of federal agencies. If they pay their own and that's outside the scope of work or agreement between sponsor and NRCS, that's a little different animal, right?
Yes, and I love you. Thank you for bringing. I love that you brought that up. So yes, if you have a project that has different elements to it, and a different federal agency is covering this component or phase of the project, and different federal agencies covering this part of it, you want to document that even early on in the planning and document who's covering what. And show that this federal agency, because NRCS is responsible for this, but another federal agency may be responsible for something else. And then obviously you would have brought them into the process of the planning, and involve them. But you'll show that the federal responsibility that NRCS has the required match that the sponsor is required to provide for that federal project. And then any federal projects any federal components that another agency, BIA or VOR has or whoever, you could show that, okay, these are the matches for that. And you can definitely show in your cost, in your budget, what goes for what, and that you have a proper cost share and a proper matching, and there's no overlap. The last thing we want to do is have someone go through an accounting nightmare and then have an audit and you have to pay back all these funds that you didn't plan on paying in the beginning. That's the last thing you want to do.
You could include it in the information, but it wouldn't be a part of the budget. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, what I was saying is you want to include that in your budget so it'll be identified clearly and explicitly that these are the funds used for this, and these are the federal funds used for that, and this is the local match to match it. So you want to explicitly include all those things so that explicitly who's covering what, and NRCS's share is definitely within the guidelines of only being its share, and the sponsor has its designated match for that share and its other designated match for the other shares. You want to define all of that clearly and detail so that there is no ambiguity and there's no issue there. That's a very good question. Love that question.
But it seemed like it was important. Hey, how about under the current program? Are there opportunities for new Public Law 566 watershed projects to be funded?
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, a lot of the new plans that you're seeing, those 111 plans that I talked about for rehab, and some of those 60 or so plans for operation, all that's new stuff. So all of these are opportunities for new. So yes, we want new projects. We want new things that show the flexibilities and the nimbleness of this program. You know, we're more than just a dam building program. We build more than dams. The projects I showed you today, some of them weren't dams, you know. So, you know, we want to show the flexibility and the nimbleness of this program to accomplish a lot of good stuff. So yes, bring the new ones, please.
Land treatment included, all that?
Yes, bring
not
them
just,
on.
dams. All right. Okay, so let's talk about the PIR requirements again. I've got 3 nice questions here all bundled together. Let's take the first one, which is any more information about the PIR requirements and process beyond what you had. I guess I'd say first, see the presentation because you did a lot there, but
Yep. But we can add some supplements to that if needed, and kind of show because we're working on the announcement that's going to go out either next week or the following on all the guidance that I'm talking about. So the NRCS folks will see that immediately, and that's really who needs to see it first and digest it so that we can then communicate it to the sponsor so that, you know, we're all on the same page of this is what's required by this PIFR. But it's nothing different than what's always been required for a preliminary investigation report. And that is basically an overview of what the project area is, what the anticipated purposes would be, the overall needs for this type of a project, the sponsors that are involved and their eligibility, their ability to meet the statutory requirements, you know, that this isn't an area where we do anticipate that there would be those agricultural benefits and rural benefits that are at least 20%, you know, and then the projected area for the benefits would not exceed that 250,000 acres, or if it did, you know, it's going to be in alliance or accordance with the waivers that are provided, you know, in the appropriations language. And I have to say the appropriation language, because it's not a statute change, is with the appropriation. So if next year, if the appropriation language doesn't include that waiver, then we wouldn't be able to use that waiver. So, you know, they would document all those types of things, and they would document the communities that they're working with, and they would document even some of the demographics and the impacts of the work that's proposed in that community, and other federal partners that may be engaged with work and similar projects in that community. So it's basically a high level overview of what this project is, what its purpose is, and who's going to be impacted by it, and then who are the people that are involved in serving on the roles as a sponsor, and maybe some of the partners that may need to be involved, and some of the other federal agencies that may need to be engaged. We're identifying all that up front. Yeah, so that's a little bit of what it's detailing.
Hey, can you speed through the process? Any ideas, Kevin, on how to speed through or move through that process more quickly? This one right here.
The PIFR, well, you know, like I said, it's only requiring like a 6 month review. I mean, it's only requiring a document that should be completed in 6 months. Many of them may be done before that. So the best way I think to speed through it is that there are sponsors out there and communities that have done somewhat of a feasibility type report already. And then you would just want to take that information and pull from it and verify, obviously, that the information is correct and accurate as up to date. I don't, you know, we may not know when the report was done, and pull from and build from some of the resources and the information that's out there already. And then I would say, even once we release this information, you see clearly the template on what's out there, you may want to just start, you know, reformatting some of those reports and things that are out there already, and making sure that it includes all of the up-to-date information. I want to stress the word up-to-date information, so that if you do decide to do a plan in the next 2 years, well, let's make sure that all my preliminary investigation and all these reports that I've been compiled over the last few years shows a lot of this information already in the format that it needs to be, so we can help NRCS when they go out to do this, that a lot of the information may be actually already there. So I think the best way to speed through it is to build off of information that's readily available and out there, and making sure that we have the resources committed to getting the investigation reports completed. That's the quickest way to speed through it.
Excellent. Okay.
But you don't want to speed through it so quickly that you have a product that doesn't adequately inform our state conservationists on what decisions we need to make moving forward. Because the last thing we want to do is get into planning and spend millions of dollars in planning and can't get anywhere. And we've done that. That has actually happened. And that's one of the reasons we're sticking to the policy on keeping those preliminary investigation reports, because we have had issues when things go into planning and they stop there. And we've had, I think, Jesse can correct me if I'm wrong, I think we have like 50 or so plans in the watershed rehab program alone that have not moved beyond the planning phase because of some issue that could have easily been identified through the assessment or something like that. That may have not have been identified. And then we're starting to see some of those same types of things creep up in the watershed ops. So you definitely don't want to put a hold on the program for those types of things. You want to air it out early.
Yeah, that number is correct, Kevin.
Oh, thank you, Jesse. Thank you very much.
Yeah. What about the consultants? We got both Jesse and we got Kevin here. How about consultants playing a role in the development of a preliminary investigation report?
So you can, but let me just say this and be kind of emphatic. You don't want to be, I guess, too biased in the reporting, because we're trying to inform our state conservationists. So there may be a role a consultant can play as far as helping to, gather information, whatever. But, when the state conservationist makes their decision and they are informed by this document, it needs to be it doesn't need to be subjective. It needs to be just, basically, this is the document. These are the facts. And just take the fact at face value, and then the facts will speak for themselves. And then you're not trying to direct the state conservation decision by, the PIFR is not a proposal. It's the facts. And that's all you want to put there is the facts. But the facts are there and outlined in a way that the state can make their decision. So, there may be a role if there's a shortage of staff to involve a consultant in developing some of the information. But when the report is finalized and put together, NRCS needs to take the lead in saying, we're reviewing this report. We stand behind what's in the report. And I feel comfortable that I'm making this decision as an agency representative to say, let's move this forward and let's get this done and move into planning.
So the use of consultants to complete field work on the PIR or PIFRA?
Yeah, there's obviously a benefit to that. Yes, to gather that basic information and gather the facts, to get the facts. Yes, to get those facts.
Okay. Let's switch
And
gears.
like I said, I hope I'm not, because I see a lot of PIFRA questions. So I hope, people aren't coming to think that, man, this is a new, workload and something new that's going to take up time. Actually, I think it's going to probably speed up things, because by doing the PIFR, you'll get a lot better planning decisions made, and you actually probably do a lot of better planning quicker by doing this PIFR. And that's why we've had it in policy now for years.
So here's duplication with purpose. The outlook for significant funding for rehab of aging public law 566 project structures that are out.
Yeah. So when you look at it, on average, I was showing you where we're averaging about 10, sometimes maybe 12, 15 million a year or so over the last 5 years. So, it's been kind of, low there, I would say, as far as funding for rehab. But, there's opportunities for whether, even someone asked the question once before about the infrastructure bill, there's opportunities there. There may be some opportunities there for additional rehab funding. The $50 million in the farm bill is eligible to be used for rehab. So if there's a huge need to utilize some of those funds for the rehab program, we have that ability and capacity to do it. We just want to make sure that it's going towards, as much as possible, some of those those construction projects, to be able to put them in those projects that can move pretty quickly and get implemented. So you have those opportunities there, but I can't say for a fact if you're going to see an increase in that average through the normal appropriation. You may see a slight increase, but you may not see an increase there. You may see more increases in the watershed ops program than you would rehab.
Not a big increase, though.
I don't believe so, but Congress may do something different the next week or two, and we all be surprised. So I don't know that, but
All right.
The trends don't show an increase. I'll just say it that way. Over the last 5 years that I showed in the presentation,
All
the
depends on
trends are showing.
Congress to make that clear. All right. What funding is available to repair the public law 566 projects due to design deficiencies? Kind of an interesting question, huh?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that in two ways. First of all, the immediate funding that's available to make those repairs is the remedial program.
Okay.
Well, I shouldn't say remedial program, but remedial funding. So watershed ops remedial funding is available for those projects that are still within their design life, and normally that's within that 50-year range, sometimes 100-year range, but normally within that 50-year range. And those projects are able to be repaired in such a way that they can be restored back to their original intent, and then perform out the rest of the life of the structure. Now, if they've exceeded that design life, our practice has been, our policy has been that we're not providing additional remedial assistance once the project has reached has completed its federal interest, and there's no longer any identified, federal benefits because it's met its life and the requirement of it to last that 50 years. So opportunities are being explored to look at ways to potentially provide additional funding for repair of structures to increase the useful life of those types of structures. And it's not necessarily extending the service life, because that's what rehab would do, is it would extend the service life. But if sponsors aren't necessarily trying to always extend the service life, and they're only looking to make some minor modifications and repairs to those low and significant hazard structures, that aren't being addressed through rehab, I think there may be opportunities there. And I'm looking forward to seeing if Congress feels the same way, and there may be some resources and funding available to kind of do those types of repairs that are not addressed in the remedial program or the rehabilitation program. I think that would be the quickest way to address a lot of that.
All right. Let's move you to the next question then, Kevin. And thank you so much. You are a workhorse here. My goodness. How much federal funding is set aside for dam rehabilitation projects? We're staying with that rehabilitation.
Yeah. So that was in the presentation. So I was showing the annual funding. So the one thing that I did mention was, that 50 million in the Farm Bill funding is available for rehab. But we've determined that, because that's annual funding, we want to put it towards those construction projects. Those projects are ready for construction. So many times that may not be those rehab projects if they're not immediately ready to move into construction. So, and if they're smaller amounts, because you want to try your best not to divvy that $50 million up too many times, because once it's in an agreement, it's there. You can't do a lot of more deviations from there. So that's available. But for the most part, the funding that we have is that $10 million a year that we've been receiving. And if there's additional funds, you'll see that.
Okay. And the next question seems to follow the same line of thought. So will there be dollars for rehabilitation? And we've seen several hundred reclassifications over the last few years and expect more.
Yeah. So same answer, basically. Yeah. So if we see, as we're seeing it, it's probably going to be on that 10 million average, unless there's something in the infrastructure bill. And if there's something in the infrastructure bill, then obviously we would want to move aggressively towards addressing as many of those rehab projects. And, questions have even come up, and I've seen, discussions about the 35% even, and if there's an opportunity to reduce that 35%, obviously that's something that has to happen through legislation. But if in the event that that is reduced, and Congress determines that we can reduce that 35% cost share for the sponsor, and then resources are provided to cover the difference, then that may be a new opportunity as well that people want to keep your eyes open for if that happens. And then I don't know that it will, but if it does happen, then that's something you definitely want to look for and see if we can't then take advantage of that and do even more rehab work.
Work through your National Watershed Coalition for some ideas on how to do that is where you would go. You would call Dr. Dan Siebert, and say, how can I help? I'll be a member and help with that, with some of those activities. Huh, Dan? Hope you're still listening. All right, we're going to say that other question. How about this one? Guidance on how NRCS can or has waived a watershed plan if the NRCS plan is unnecessary or duplicative of other plans. Interesting question.
Yeah, I think we covered that one a little bit in the program, but I see Dr. Siebert is on, so I don't know if he wants to chime in real quick on the previous question before I start.
That's on this one. Can we get some increased fundings for rehabilitation?
Yeah, I do. I can speak a little more freely about that than perhaps Kevin can. We'll get what we ask for, basically, and the number that you see in that rehab allocation over the last few years is a product of several things. Initially, the amount of funding that was spent on rehab was kind of held in check by NRCS's capacity to deliver the program, which coming off of, I believe Kevin said, a 9-year period when there hadn't been any watershed funding, the capacity to deliver had somewhat been put in mothballs, basically. So there are some areas of expertise that needed to come to the forefront in order to be successful in running a rehabilitation program. And under Kevin's leadership and others, the rehab part of the program has gotten to be more viable. Jesse does a great job. But the point is that during that same period of time, there were several continuing resolutions. And when you have a continuing resolution, you only get a percentage of a previous budget in a certain budget category. And that's basically where that, say, 10 to 14 million in rehab came from. It was reflective of the percentage that was allowable under 2 or 3 successive continuing resolutions. Well, folks in Congress work kind of like we all do, in that when we're required to do a document, many times we go back and find an old one and we cut and paste things into a new one. And believe it or not, within that budget process, that happens. So when you look in that category and you see 10 to 14 million, a couple of 2 or 3 years in a row, when budget is being formatted, the staff, the congressional staff, looks at that and thinks, well, we haven't heard any different, so that must be a good number, and they'll put that number in there. It's not quite that simple, but you'd be surprised. Some days it is. So the coalition has advocated for 75 million a year as rehab funding. That's been our number. It was based on some public information that NRCS had made available over the years, but we believe it should be funded at about a $75 million level. Now, if we're successful in increasing the rehab allocation, there are some folks out across the country that are going to hump up and provide the documentation and initiate the interest in order to expend that money and see that money go into rehabilitation construction. But we advocate for 75 million a year. This year, in talking to congressional staff, the question was not, what is rehab? Explain this to us. The question was, how much money do you guys need? And we said, well, it's sure not $10 million. It's more than that. And they were kind of surprised. I said, well, look, it's been this much, so many years. And we explained to them just what I kind of shared with you. So I believe that with the ask, with the demonstrated need for more rehab money, with the activation of requests from folks out in the countryside that have work that is unfunded, I believe with all those things coming together that the future is bright for rehab funding, including additional rehab funding beyond that Farm Bill money that's going to be there forever and ever. Amen. So if I had a rehab interest, I'd be talking to my delegation when it was appropriations time about what my state needs were, specifically for the rehab program. And, we would sure appreciate that. We go up there and work for everybody, but we don't know about every project that needs funding. So if you want to jump in there with us when we go and talk to folks about how much is needed for that, you're certainly welcome.
Jump in, the water's fine. And that's not something that Kevin's going to even know about necessarily, but Dr. Dan, the fellow, the smiling face that's there on your screen right now with Kevin, would know how to do that, how best to do that. I got a couple of quick questions here, and then we're going to move right to the recommendations because we got about 15 minutes left in our webinar, and we want to get those recommendations harvested and make sure that all of the 90 some folks that are still with us have their opportunity for their recommendation that they would provide. So here's the last question, and with the caveat that Kevin said that the questions that were submitted either during the webinar or during the registration period would be responded to you in writing. So look for that on the National Watershed Coalition website in a couple of weeks. What's the timeline for the manual and handbook revisions?
Excellent question. So we've drafted a number of revisions here over the last year or two. One of them was the language about the top of dam and, development below the top of dam. And so we addressed that issue. And then we have some issues related to PRNG and how to implement PRNG. So we have some of those things. But backing up some, we wanted to, as an agency, review all of our policy and determine how to best fit everything, especially policy related to that involves planning. And as watershed program policy would involve some planning as well, and see how can we best fit it into our core business practices. And for us, that core business practices are 9 steps of planning. So in order for us to best fit our current manual into that with the additional revisions that are taking place, we've recently been charged with the responsibility of, as an agency, taking on the responsibility to revise our policy and make sure that it aligns with all other policies involving planning. So we've actually just started that effort and kicked it off last month. And we had a timeline to expect that to actually be completed by July. But in looking at it, I think we got to back and reschedule it and kind of identify what the new timeline may be. So I don't have a fixed date to say I know what the new timeline is. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I don't have that. But we are being asked to revise that timeline. So that hasn't happened yet. We actually just completed our last update meeting on this past Monday. So since that time, we haven't had a chance to actually go back and revise our timeline for understanding when the new policy would be feasible to get out, and even kind of narrowing down the scope of what all those changes may be to develop a better product. We do believe that in some of these revisions that we're proposing to take place, that the product will be a lot more simple and something that will be a lot more definitive that states can follow and get the product that we expect as an agency to be developed. But honestly, I don't have a solid time on when we expect that just yet. Unfortunately, we're in the early stages of re-scoping it. As we kind of re-scope it, we'll know the time as the scope is better defined. So I apologize, not a good answer there, but it's the truth. So I don't want to make up something and lead you down the wrong road.
Folks, this is your time now, and we're going to ask you to enter this in the chat, not the questions area, but the chat this time. And the question for you that we really want you to address will be, let me put it right back up on the screen again, will be our question on what recommendation do you have for our NRCS watershed staff and the leaders of NRCS regarding how to make the watershed programs that you've learned about today even more responsive and good for you. And so let me put this right up on the screen. The question is, what is the most important recommendation you would recommend after hearing today's presentation, that you would recommend that we would have? Hang on one second. Let me get that up here for you. Coming back. Gonna have to do this the old-fashioned way, I guess. It's not cooperating with me, sorry. Okay. And we'll share back the one question that we've got for you. Coming up now. So we're going to have you enter this in the chat area. And the best way to do that is just to type recommendation on the front end of your recommendation, enter it in the chat. What is your most important recommendation you would suggest for making the watershed program better for sponsors and our partners? So type in your recommendation, get that chat going, send those in to us. That'll be great. We want to hear all of them coming in. And so we're pumping the brakes a couple times. You can send it to all also if you want to. That would be great. And we'll see these coming up as you send them in. So this is Again, for those of you that sent in some things, I want to make sure that you know that we will be addressing all the questions. Okay. We need more NRCS staff, more training for those staff is a recommendation. The recommendation is having a dedicated multidisciplinary team for the state's watershed program is another recommendation that we had come in. Keep those recommendations coming in. We'll log these and we'll be sending those out to you in the notes also. Another recommendation that came in is provide examples of plans of work, scoping documents, and applications that are acceptable to NRCS. Excellent. I'm going to go over here and just find a place to log these so that you can see them come up. Keep those recommendations coming in to us.
Hey, Ray, I see a few good questions in here. Do you mind if I answer some of them while we're going?
No, but I've got those recommendations are piling in now, Kevin. So,
Oh, well, hey, if you're getting the recommendations, I don't want to interrupt. Let's do it. Let's do it.
so another recommendation is more direction and guidance documents to help the sponsors understand the detailed process, Kevin. And then there was an agreement here, larger engineering staffs at state offices, including those to do project work. And as well, NRCS and engineering seems to be undergraded. More GAS 13s at the state level is a recommendation. So we got a few recommendations. Need to train NRCS at the area and field on the watershed programs. A recommendation for the examples of the examples of plans of work, scoping documents, and etc. came in.
Some good recommendations.
Got a kudos from one individual about the great presentation. Really appreciate your time, and to submit a recommendation after the webinar is fine. We've still got some more recommendations coming in. Keep those coming in. We need a firm commitment from our management. And I'm sure this is from NRCS perspective to focus on rebuilding and training our future employees. And we've got more questions coming in, and we'll get to those in writing as they start to come in. Adopt a formal NEPA Section 106 coordinated review. Another couple of folks here just making note of the good presentation that was done today during the course of our webinar. So we really appreciate that. Okay. Now I'm going to switch to a poll with just a few minutes left here. I'm going to poll the group, and the polling is going to be for how best that the National Watershed Coalition can best reach you with good, timely information. So we're winding down here a bit. We've got a few more minutes, and I've just opened up the poll for you. Select the best way for the National Watershed Coalition to reach you with good, timely information. So you can go ahead and tap the one that you think is the best way for our National Watershed Coalition to reach you. Could be by webinar, email, listserv, conference meeting, or text system of some kind, and we'll let that play out here in just a bit. And while that's playing out, if you saw a question there, Kevin, that caught your interest, please do step in and go ahead and talk with us about that.
Yeah, my good friend Herb, Mr. Graves, I had a question I saw about the 5 years. If your design is past the 5 years and you're still working on it, would you need to do a feasibility report, feasibility assessment on the design? If the design is past 5 years and you've been working on it for 5 years, you know, you wouldn't necessarily need to do that. What we're really talking about is those designs that have been sitting and no work was done on it at all over the course of any time. It was completed, fully completed. It's been reviewed, it's been approved and ready for construction. However, construction never took place. And then it sat for more than 5 years after it was completed and final review was completed on it. But if you have a project that you've just been working on, the design has been ongoing, and obviously I would anticipate the engineers will be reviewing it anyway to make sure that their design assumptions are accurate and nothing has actually changed from their initial field data that they started with, and that the design is accurate. Otherwise, there's some liabilities there that the engineers may want to check on their own. So if it's been going on for 5 years and they just haven't finished it, I'm thinking that they're going to do their due diligence to make sure. So that's that. Then another question came up. I don't necessarily know the individual, but I saw the question about drought is in an eligible practice or purpose for EWP. And absolutely, there's now currently an evaluation of how we can address drought issues out west now with the current drought. And there are different EWP measures that can be used for drought. Now, obviously, EQIP may have better, resources when you start looking at on farm and individual landowners to address things like wells and installation of different measures for drought. But there may be instances where drought does cause or enhance the ability for erosion. And there are some measures through EWP that can be done. And absolutely, the state conservations can determine and make that declaration for a drought determination or a disaster determination as a whole. And yes, you would be eligible for EWP because that is a designated purpose for the EWP program.
Kevin, thanks so much. There's so many things to go around. Let me just share the results of the survey here. By far and away, Dan, they said that email, it looks like 64% of them said email, 26% webinar, 8% a conference or a meeting, and also the text. And so, so very, very good there. Let's talk a little bit about now where we're going to go with some of our timelines and things like that. I want to post these for you, and just call upon Dan and Kevin and your staff, Kevin, to review any of the timelines you feel like the folks need to know before we close here today.
Our only timeline right now, because we're moving to the rolling program, the only timeline we have right now is that June 30th deadline for watershed rehab. Request for fiscal year 2022 would want to be submitted by June 30th. With no other timelines are really out there now because we're moving into that rolling period. So that's the only timeline.
Thanks so much. And Dan, I think you've got a couple of things that you wanted to talk with the folks about, please, about timelines, some events that are going to be coming up very soon.
I do, Ray. Thank you. After much thought, we are moving bravely ahead with our October biennial meeting in Spokane, Washington. We will meet in conjunction with the National Association of State Conservation Agencies once again. You can see the dates there on your screen. You'll also note that we will do our very best to follow CDC, state and local public health protocols during this meeting. So we invite you to mark your calendars, and hopefully the location of this meeting is going to be close for some of the folks that are on this Western webinar today. Between now and then, there'll actually be a couple of other NWC webinars. The next one coming up is June the 17th, and it will deal with the effectiveness of watershed boards and their employees and communication, a little bit of everything for everybody that on the sponsor side to strengthen the capacity, to strengthen partnerships. The fact that partnerships are involved definitely makes this appropriate for our NRCS brothers and sisters to participate if they so desire, but that'll be coming up on June 17. There'll be more information about that in your email, as well as on the NWC Facebook page and website.
Well, thanks, Dan. And you get to do you and Lisa, if you want to say a few closing remarks to our folks.
I just appreciate Kevin Farmer so much. He's going to have to change his batteries after the last 2 days. I don't know if he uses energizers or not, but I appreciate your work, Kevin, and appreciate all the good work that NRCS as an agency is doing around the country. I know from some of the questions we received today that there are some folks where there is genuine interest in the watershed program. It provides an avenue to address some water resource issues. There are barriers, but I sense that there are people out there willing to tackle those. And I appreciate you taking time today to bring folks up to speed on how things operate here in 2021. Much appreciated.
Thank you for the opportunity, Dan. Thank you all for making this happen.
Thank you,
Mhm.
Kevin. Thank you, Dan. Lisa may have jumped off. So that concludes our webinar today. If your question was not answered during the course of our event, it will be answered in writing and sent back to you. Keep watching the National Watershed Coalition website in the next couple of weeks for information from this. Also, the PowerPoint presentation and things like that will be posted there, along with the notes and the questions and the answers in writing. And so don't miss any of that opportunity to do that. The recording will also be there eventually, probably within that 2-week period too. So thanks so much, folks, and be well. Get some great conservation work done, and we'll see you down the road. Thanks so much.